Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause. Well more than a year since Alison Thewlis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.
Good afternoon. Our first item of business today is Time for Reflection, and our Time for Reflection leader is the Reverend Leslie Belinda, who is the Vicar of St Andrew's Church, Fulham Fields, and guest speaker at the National Prayer Breakfast for Scotland.
Presiding Officer, members of the Scottish Parliament. Recently, I've been watching the Scottish Parliament TV channel. I have to admit it's not something I regularly do. In fact, this was the first and perhaps the only time I've watched it. But a friend gave me a heads up that there was going to be an item on the 25th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide, and I have a particular connection there. In April 1994, when the genocide began, I had been living in Rwanda for nearly 5 years. I was a midwife running a community health programme with Tear Fund, and I was married to an Anglican Rwandan priest. Rwanda was my home. However, from April to July 1994, as the world's media brought graphic images of massacre and genocide into our sitting rooms, most people reached for the atlas, there were no Google Maps in those days, of course, to try and locate this tiny, little-known country. Savages was the word most often used to describe the perpetrators. But for me, both those being killed and those doing the killing were my friends, my neighbours, and my colleagues. My husband, Charles, was a Tutsi, and although many of his family survived thanks to the immense kindness and courage of Hutu neighbours, Charles was not so fortunate. The The genocide didn't start with clubs and machetes. It was many years in the making, and it started with words. It began in subtle ways: discrimination, humiliation, and mocking, treating others as less than human, the language of hate. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks writes of how genocide emerges out of the dehumanization and demonization of the other, and this was most certainly the case in Rwanda. Tutsis and Tutsi sympathizers were described as rats or cockroaches, vermin to be trampled on and annihilated. But when we treat others as less than human, we lose something of our own humanity. When we try to destroy others, whether physically with a machete or ideologically with our words, we destroy something of ourselves. It's only when we treat one another with dignity and respect, regardless of our differences, that we can be truly and fully human. Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu describes this as Ubuntu, the Southern African concept of interdependence and mutuality. A person with Ubuntu, he says, is affirming of others, not threatened that others are able and good, and is diminished when others are humiliated or treated as if they were less than who they are. In the Christian church, when we as Christians meet together to share the bread and wine, the reminder of Jesus giving of himself for the world, we put aside our differences. We're on a level playing field, and we focus on the bigger picture, which is God's kingdom, on all that unites us as brothers and sisters together. To say never again to genocide means that we pledge ourselves not only to deter future genocide, but to avoid the factors that lead to polarizations and divisions by treating one another with dignity and respect, even those with whose ideas we totally disagree. In this way, we pledge to build a stronger community, locally, nationally, and globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we turn to our next item of business, which is topical questions. Our first question is from Colin Smyth.
Thank you, President Officer. To ask the Scottish Government by what date the R100 project is expected to deliver its target of 100% super-fast broadband coverage.
Minister Paul Wheelhouse.
As outlined in my update to Parliament on Friday, the procurement is ongoing and delivery timescales will be confirmed once we have a supplier or suppliers in place later this year. The £600 million that we've committed to the R100 programme is a vital investment in Scotland's national infrastructure, and 96.5% of that investment is coming from the Scottish Government, despite broadband services being wholly the legal and regulatory responsibility of UK ministers. We do this because we want to secure the right outcome for Scotland, one that will underpin digital connectivity and economic growth for decades to come, and we will work to deliver that as early as possible.
Colin Smyth.
Thank the Minister for that answer, but it didn't actually answer the question. The question was very specifically, when is the Government expected to deliver its target of 100% superfast broadband? Now, previously, the Government were very clear. They said consistently it would be by 2021. Now, the Minister now seems to be saying it will be as soon as possible. So can the Minister answer the question, will the Government meet its commitment to deliver superfast broadband R100 by 2021? Yes or no?
Minister.
As I said in my original answer, if Mr Smith had been listening, that we will confirm this once we have a supplier or suppliers in place. It's part of the actual negotiations with the bidders. We are setting them our objective of achieving goals by 2021, and we're inviting the bidders, this is how bidding works, to submit their bids on the basis of how much they will deliver by 2021. So clearly it's impossible to say at this point in time, during the live procurement process, exactly what we will see. But I certainly want to commit to give Parliament, as soon as we have a preferred bidder in place, and we have, as I say in my answer, dealt with that, then we'll be able to come back to Parliament with more certainty about the delivery timescales.
Colin Smyth.
Thank you, President Officer. I think that was possibly the longest no I've actually heard. It's quite clear that the Government are clearly not going to hit the original target you set. So can I ask specifically, the Minister's announced that the contracts are now being awarded effectively a year later than they were originally being awarded. So does the Minister, can he say now that meeting that target and meeting the coverage the Government believed they would meet by the end of 2021 or by 2021 is now less likely as a result of these delays in awarding the contract, or are you still on target?
Minister.
Well, we've always, Presiding Officer, acknowledged that 2021 would be a challenging target to meet, and given the scale and complexity of the procurement, legally, financially and technically, we'll not sacrifice our aim of achieving the best result for Scotland. I am confident the process is working well. We've maintained competition throughout the process, which is vital to try and ensure we get a good deal for the public taxpayer. But we are getting good engagement through the process, and I would hope to give Mr Smyth confidence that the Scottish Government is delivering well on broadband. I mean, I only have to direct him to the Ofcom 2018 Connected Nations report, which confirmed that Scotland continues to outperform the UK as a whole in terms of providing superfast broadband access, and stating, and I quote, because I hear some scoffing from the left, over the past year, and I quote here, over the past year, i.e. 2017 to 2018, the coverage of superfast broadband across the UK increased from 91% to 94%, with Scotland seeing the largest increase of 5 percentage points from 87% to 92%, unquote. And Ofcom figures they also show that since the DSSB, the Digital Scotland Superfast Broadband Programme, began in 2014, access to superfast broadband has increased by 31 percentage points in Scotland, compared with just 19 percentage points in the UK. So we are doing well. We want to carry our track record forward in delivering R100. And as I've said, Presiding Officer, to the member, I'm confident I'll be able to give members a fuller update once the procurement process proceeds to the preferred bidder stage and an appointment of the contractors. We'll have more information about the delivery timescales.
There are 5 members who wish to get in, so if we can try and be succinct, we might get through all 5. Finlay Carson.
For 18 months, this government's been crowing about R100 being delivered by 2021. That's since Derek Mackay's 2017 budget announcement, giving false hope to constituents right around the country. 600 million has been promised, but in reality, on the ground, investment in broadband infrastructure has fallen from 114 million in 2017-18 to only 32.9 in 2019-20. Will you apologise to my constituents and take immediate action to support businesses in my constituency who are struggling for any kind of connectivity? Despite your protestations to the contrary, the SNP government have responsibility for the rollout of areas where commercial providers are unable or unwilling to provide it on a commercial basis.
Well, Mr Carson, predictably, has gone for this line of attack, I have to say. I need to remind Mr Carson, as I have done to several Conservative MPs and MSPs who have written to me on broadband issues, that, and as I said in my answer, that legally and regulatory responsibilities are the responsibility of the UK ministers. And in terms of the delivery...
All right, let the Minister answer, please. Mr
Carson wants to direct things to delivery. Let's talk about delivery in Dumfries and Galloway. When the DSSB programme commenced, in Dumfries and Galloway, just 17% of premises in Dumfries and Galloway could have a superfast broadband connection. By February of this year, 2019, 83.3% can now have a superfast connection. So that is the record of delivery. As I read out in my response to Mr Smyth, Ofcom, if the member wants to disagree with Ofcom have highlighted the Scottish Government's track record is better than that of the UK Government. As I said, 31% increase in Scotland since January 2014, 19% in the UK as a whole. And despite the most challenging geography in these islands, we have overachieved compared to the UK average.
Richard Lyle to be followed by Edward Mountain.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Minister advise how the approach here in Scotland differs from that being taken by the UK Government, because it is reserved? How that impacts on R100, what contribution the UK Government is making to R100, and what the UK Government's target date for 100% access to superfast broadband is?
Minister.
Well, it's an extremely important point. As Richard Lyle has said, the UK Government does not have a commitment for 100% superfast coverage across the UK. Scotland is the only part of the UK to have made such a commitment, one supported by £600 million of public investment targeted towards the areas that need it most. Only £21 million, or 3.5% of that £600 million cost, is coming from the UK Government, despite responsibility for broadband being wholly reserved to Westminster. The UK Government have indicated an objective to have full fibre access across the UK by 2033, but no funding has been committed, no funding, in support of this ambition, and the Scottish Government is not waiting. We have acted. The £600 million that we've committed to the R100 programme will put Scotland in an enviable position as one of the best connected nations in Europe, and that's something I would hope members across this chamber will get behind.
Edward Mountain to be followed by Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Given that NHS Highland is starting to rely on superfast broadband to deliver its near-me treatment service, do you agree with me that the failure to deliver R100 on time is bad for the health of Highlanders?
Minister.
Mr Mountain is trying to make a point here which I think is extremely unfair. In Highland alone, between January 2014 and February 2019, so this is the impact of the Digital Scotland Superfast Broadband Programme, there's been an increase of 58.3% in access to superfast coverage. That, again, is well above the 19% increase we've seen across the UK over the same period. So, if anything, Highlands has been well served by the investment this government is making, and the stewardship of the DSSB programme with our partners has delivered an outstanding result. And perhaps the member might want to acknowledge that. I do agree with him that access to broadband is extremely important for new innovation areas such as health innovation, and clearly through CivTech and other measures we're actually pioneering new approaches to the use of digital technology in the NHS Highland area, and I think that will benefit hugely from the investment in R100 and the continued investment in DSSB.
Stuart Stevenson to be followed by Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Is the Minister aware of the UK Government's announcement on the universal service provision for broadband, which is for a lower speed than that of the R100 programme? But more fundamentally, it is a capped investment where the subscriber will have to pay any extra money above the cap the UK Government are putting in place. Is such a cap in place for the R100 programme?
Minister.
Well, in short answer to Mr Stevenson, no, there is no such cap in R100. We are looking not only to spend the £600 million through the initial R100 procurement, but we've always acknowledged we may need aligned interventions to supplement that. I am concerned that the initiatives that are in place as a result of the UK Government's decisions around universal service obligation will be insufficient to provide the cost of delivering a connection in many rural properties, and I think the member is absolutely right to highlight that. But we are trying to work with UK ministers to see how we can combine our efforts in respect of voucher schemes, try and get the best bang for the public buck, and make sure we do as much as we can to accelerate deployment in those areas affected by poor service at this present time.
And Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Thank you very much. Despite the picture being painted by the Minister and other SNP members today that all seems to be rosy, in the broadband garden, a Which survey released earlier this year showed that parts of my Highlands and Islands region have amongst the worst broadband speeds in the country, with Orkney having the slowest speeds for any local authority area, Shetland not far behind, and Murray the worst mainland authority. So, as a time when more and more services are moving online, has the Scottish Government made any analysis of the wider cost of these delays to broadband rollout, particularly in Scotland's remote and rural communities?
Minister.
I would just say to Mr Halker-Johnson, Presiding Officer, that I've highlighted a number of times now, the rollout in Scotland has been faster than the UK average. Starting from a lower base, we've caught up only 2 points behind. And in regards to, I know that a member takes a particular interest in Orkney Islands, for example, in the absence of DSSB, there would be 11.1% of premises in Orkney Islands would have had access to superfast broadband. Currently, it's 65.1%, and we are looking to the R100 programme. The R1 programme, well, if the member would listen, the R100 programme, we have set a commitment, mandated areas across all of them in the Highlands and Islands that have to be delivered by the selected bidders, and also we set weighted areas, in particular in our island communities, to make sure that we do address the deficiencies in broadband coverage. But I would just remind him and other members, this is actually a responsibility, regulatory terms and legally, of the UK Government. We are merely taking the funding that has been allocated, augmenting it with our resources and doing better than the UK Government in rolling out the schemes.
Apologies to Rhoda Grant. There's no more time for any questions. There's a lot of interest in that subject, I can tell. But question number 2, Alasdair Allan.
To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking to protect Scotland's fisheries interests around Rockall.
Cabinet Secretary Fiona Hislop.
Our relationship with Ireland is strong and we value it highly. Our aim is to reach an amicable position with the Irish Government. Before I set out the latest steps, it may be helpful to Parliament if I provide some background. In 2017, the Scottish Government became aware of a significant increase in fishing by Irish vessels in the territorial seas and fishing grounds within 12 nautical miles of Rockall. Irish and other EU vessels can, of course, fish in the external 200 nautical miles of the exclusive economic zone with quota. In April 2017, the then Irish Foreign Minister asked to speak with me about his concerns regarding potential enforcement by Marine Scotland. Since 2017, we have had regular ministerial meetings and calls where this issue has been discussed alongside official level meetings. We have made various political and diplomatic efforts to resolve the issue without the need for enforcement action. In September 2018, given no resolution had been reached, we notified the Irish Government that in the absence of an agreed way forward, we would need to prepare enforcement options in line with international law, and that we would give them notice of such action. Dialogue is continuing between the Irish and Scottish Governments. There have been close contacts at official level over recent days, and it has now been agreed that a process of intensified engagement will take place, led by senior officials from both administrations. We want to reach an agreement with governments, and our governments are talking as we speak in an effort to do so. While that discussion takes place, Marine Scotland will continue to monitor the area using aerial and satellite capabilities.
Thank you. Alasdair Allan.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for her reply. The Scottish Government clearly does, as she has said, have the legal right to regulate fishing rights and access up to 12 nautical miles from Rockall, and that is laid out in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. She will be aware of the importance of the fishing industry to my own constituency and to many other communities across Scotland. So is the Cabinet Secretary able to outline to Parliament what increase in activity around Rockall there has been in recent years and what impact has the notice of enforcement had on any such activity?
Cabinet Secretary.
I agree entirely that sustainable fishing and responsible fisheries management depend to a large degree on adherence and enforcement of the law. In recent years, activity by Irish vessels in the area had increased sharply from 15 incursions in 2015 to 33 in 2016 and 94 in 2017. In 2018, there was a slight decrease in activity due to a change in fishing quotas and the absence of some seasonal fisheries. Surveillance by Marine Scotland has shown a decrease in Irish vessels' activity in the area as a result of the notice of enforcement action. Official and ministerial channels have always remained open through this period, and I welcome the move to intensify discussions in the coming days.
Alasdair Allan.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that information. As she has outlined, Rockall is recognised in domestic law as part of Scotland, and the Scottish Government clearly therefore does have a duty and obligation to regulate the use of the territorial waters around it. The actions of the Scottish Government in showing our determination to protect the rights and interests of Scottish fishermen, as well as willingness to engage in discussions, have demonstrated, I think, that we take the protection of our fishing interests seriously. So, would the Cabinet Secretary confirm that this dispute does not, in her view, impact on our constructive relations with Ireland? And will she or the Rural Affairs Secretary report back to Parliament on the outcome of the discussions currently underway?
Cabinet Secretary.
It is our duty to protect the interests of the Scottish fishing industry and our territorial seas, and we have an obligation to uphold the law and exercising our rights under international law, just as other countries do. Scotland has a strong and enduring relationship with our nearest neighbours, Ireland, which we value greatly, one demonstrated by our regular ministerial conversations and our political, economic and social connections. We hope that strong relationship will help lead to a constructive resolution. Parliament will be updated as and when there are further developments.
Andy Whiteman.
I thank you, Presiding Officer. I declare an interest as an Irish citizen. The Minister will be aware that Rockall was annexed by the British Crown on the advice of the Colonial Office when in September 1955 Lieutenant Commander Scott landed in the Rock, raised the Union flag and announced in the name of Her Majesty, I hereby take possession of this island of Rockall. Does the Minister agree with me that we should reject complicity in Britain's last act of colonialism, make it clear we'll have nothing to do with such land grabs and instead renounce any Scottish claims over Rockall?
Cabinet Secretary.
Clearly, the sovereignty issue by the UK Government is one thing. Management of fisheries and sustainable fisheries, I would have thought, would be something that the member would be interested in. Our obligations and our responsibilities are clear in relation to the responsibilities of this Parliament in relation to fisheries management, and sustainable fisheries management and recognition of the importance of the fisheries industry to Scotland's economic interests is something that we in the Scottish Government will continue to promote. But as I said, I value very much our relationships. We want to strike a new relationship with Ireland as we progress, and of course there may be difficulties along the way, but the way to resolve these are in diplomatic discussions, which we have had and will continue to have with the Irish Government.
Thank you very much. I'm going to apologise to Rhoda Grant once more and to Peter Chapman. Apologies, there's not enough time. I imagine both subjects will be coming back to the Chamber, but we're going to move on to the next item of business, which is a statement by John Swinney, the Cabinet Secretary, on an update on P1 standardised assessments. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end. I would encourage all members who wish to ask a question of the Cabinet Secretary to press their request to speak buttons as soon as they possibly can. Okay. And I call on John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, on the 19th of September last year, Parliament debated the Scottish National Standardised Assessments and voted in favour of a motion that called for two distinct actions: a halt to P1 assessments and for us to consider the evidence about how best to progress the assessment of pupils in P1. I understand the views expressed in this Parliament and I am alive to the concerns expressed by MSPs and others about the P1 assessments. In the light of the parliamentary motion, I judged the appropriate response was to reconsider the evidence, and that if we were to stop P1 assessments, that decision should be based on independent expert educational advice. I therefore commissioned an independent review of the Scottish National Standardised Assessments in Primary 1. The purpose of the review was to take a clear, reasoned look at the evidence and provide an informed way forward. The review would have had sufficient scope to endorse the criticisms voiced on the 19th of September and recommend an end to the SNSAs in P1, should that be what the evidence directed. I set out this approach clearly to Parliament on the 25th of October. Taking advice from Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Education, I commissioned David Reedy to conduct that review. Mr Reedy possessed the necessary educational experience and expertise to secure professional credibility for this role. Mr Reedy was, for example, co-director of the Cambridge Primary Review Trust from 2013 to 2017 and has served as both General Secretary and President of the United Kingdom Literacy Association. As someone who had not been involved in the debate on SNSAs until that point, he was also perfectly positioned to apply the required objective rigour to this review. Between January and March this year, David Reedy gathered information, conducting stakeholder interviews, inviting written feedback and examining the submissions to and findings from the P1 Practitioner Forum and the Education and Skills Committee inquiry into the Scottish National Standardised Assessments. Crucially, he visited schools to observe the SNSA being delivered to Primary 1 children in real time. The review could not have been fully or meaningfully informed had it not been possible for Mr Reedy to witness children undertaking the assessments first-hand and to talk to the teachers involved. The Scottish Government gave clear advice to schools in September. They should continue to implement the assessments as they had been doing, pending the findings of the independent review commissioned to re-examine the evidence at Parliament's behest. Continuing to deliver the assessments was encouraged both for reasons of consistency, guarding against the creation of an information vacuum, and to ensure that the independent review was considering evidence based on the second year of assessment delivery. This was also undertaken with the recognition that feedback had already been gathered and acted upon to further improve the system, particularly in relation to P1 following the first year. There would have been little value in examining a position from which SNSAs had already moved on. 142 Primary 1 teachers 131 senior school staff and more than 50 wider stakeholders were involved during this phase, and I thank everyone who took the time to submit comments or agreed to meet with or demonstrate the assessments to David Reedy. Their contributions and the sharing of their views was of the utmost importance in helping Mr Reedy form his conclusions. Those conclusions have been published today, alongside a set of recommendations, both for the Scottish Government and for local authorities. Having been asked explicitly to consider whether the Primary 1 assessments should be stopped, Mr Reedy's answer in his independent review is that they should not. Rather, David Reedy concludes it would be beneficial for them to continue, albeit with important modifications and the establishment of additional guidance and support for practitioners to ensure they deliver their intended value as low-stakes diagnostic assessments. Mr Reedy acknowledges that the assessments can provide an additional source of objective, nationally consistent information about where a child is performing strongly and where he or she might require further support. I do not suggest this review has delivered an unqualified green light to the Scottish Government in terms of P1 assessments. Clearly, the review makes important recommendations about improvement, and I am determined to take the valuable learning contained within Mr Reedy's review and act upon it to introduce the recommended modifications and safeguards in order to, firstly, further improve the assessment experience for P1s, secondly, strengthen understanding of the purpose of the assessments, and thirdly, to ensure that practitioners see the benefit of the information the assessments provide. Fundamentally, however, the key review finding which Mr Reedy articulates in his report, and the key message that should be taken away from his report is this: Primary 1 Scottish National Standardised Assessment has potential to play a significant role in informing and enhancing teachers' professional judgments and should be continued. I was reassured to read that Mr Reedy identified, and I quote, scant evidence of children becoming upset when taking the P1 SNSA, but I acknowledge the significance of his observation that the attitudes of those delivering assessments can influence children's confidence. We must ensure practitioners are appropriately supported and equipped to deliver assessments in such a way that they are perceived positively by the children undertaking them. Mr Reedy also considered the compatibility of the assessments with a play-based approach to learning. The review makes a clear and helpful distinction between a pedagogical approach to play-based learning in the early years, which the Scottish Government fully endorses and which is at the heart of the curriculum for excellence at early level, and what David Reedy describes as a moment of assessment. The review confirmed that it was eminently possible and indeed valuable to assess children in the early years through diagnostic means such as the SNSA, while remaining true to the principles of play-based learning. The report states, and again I quote, there are strong examples of schools where head teachers and teachers operate a play-based approach and find no incompatibility between that and the Primary 1 SNSA. It is evident that the need for a shared understanding of the aims, purpose and value of the SNSA drives many of the review recommendations. I am happy to commit today to redoubling our efforts in terms of communications and engagement with practitioners and all stakeholders, to clarifying our messages, strengthening our guidance and ensuring wider access to SNSA training. Mr Reedy also identified important reservations regarding the length of the literacy assessment and its alignment to the benchmarks. Again, I accept the recommendation to review that assessment and explore with ACER, the company who developed the assessments, the potential for reducing the number of questions presented to Primary 1 children. Before concluding, Presiding Officer, I'd like to take a moment to reflect on the wider scrutiny of the SNSAs which is run in parallel with the review. As members will be aware, the Education and Skills Committee has now reported on their inquiry into the SNSAs. The P1 Practitioner Forum I convened last December has produced a number of recommendations for enhancing the P1 assessment experience. In addition, our own annual user review, intended to feed into our cycle of continuous improvement for the assessments, has produced interim findings ahead of the end of the school session. I thank the committee and the P1 Forum, chaired by Professor Sue Ellis, for their thoughtful and detailed consideration of the issues. All of their reports contain valuable suggestions for ways in which to improve aspects of the communications around and implementation of the SNSAs. Importantly, none has made any recommendation to scrap the assessments. That, I believe, reflects the evidence that Parliament required us to consider and provides the basis and the rationale for the SNSAs to continue to be applied as the independent review recommends. Where further vindication needed, I would direct members' attention to the learner feedback we have gathered during this academic year from a question within the SNSA system itself. 91% of Primary 1 children who have undertaken the assessments say that they enjoyed the experience. That statistics represents the views of the children themselves. I accept there is work to be done, but believe that with the improvements proposed, we can move forward in the correct direction. Today I published the Scottish Government's individual responses to Mr Reedy's independent review, the Education and Skills Committee's inquiry report and the P1 Practitioner Forum, along with the progress report on the SNSA user review for 2018-19. In addition, given the clear overlap in focus and read-across between a number of areas raised in the different reports, I intend to publish a summary that draws together all of the actions the Scottish Government will undertake over the coming months. I have published a draft of that action plan today. The draft identifies 8 overarching themes for actions to be taken forward in response to all report recommendations. We will take that draft to the Scottish Education Council for review and feedback, working with practitioners to agree the details of our approach to implementing recommendations before producing a final action plan at the start of the new school year. Presiding Officer, as Parliament requested, I have reconsidered the evidence. As we approach the end of the second year of delivery, we now have a far clearer picture of the views of both P1 children and their teachers towards these assessments. An impartial review has confirmed the value of the SNSAs. A constructive action plan for enhancing the assessments, consolidating their value and delivering on their potential has been laid out. I hope that members will join me in accepting Mr Reedy's findings and in focusing, as we must, on delivering an education system in Scotland which raises attainment for all, closes the attainment gap, enables all children and young people to fulfil their potential.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. I'll just remind members that we're very pushed for time this afternoon. So after the opening questioners for each of the parties have had their opening statements, I'd like all questions to be succinct and to the point and answers likewise. I call Liz Smyth to be followed by Ian Gray.
Thank you, and can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his statement and also for the copy of the independent review. The Cabinet Secretary states that on the 19th of September last year, this Parliament voted to halt the P1 tests and to review the evidence. And let me remind him why the Parliament and the opposition parties were doing that. That was because we were listening to the concerns, the many concerns that were expressed by primary teachers, parents' groups, teaching unions, who told us that there was not sufficient evidence to prove that the tests were in the best educational interests of Primary 1 pupils. These concerns were then echoed at the Education Committee on the 30th of January by other organisations such as Upstart Scotland and Children in Scotland. So my 3 questions to the Cabinet Secretary relate to the evidence. What specific educational evidence has the Cabinet Secretary seen which convinces him that he is right and others wrong when it comes to promoting this type of formal testing of 5-year-olds as being both necessary and appropriate, particularly in light of the fact that the Reedy Review has not undertaken any in-depth analysis of the evidence from other countries which do not start formal testing as early as P1. Secondly, can the Cabinet Secretary tell the Parliament why, in light of the Parliament voting against these P1 tests, he chose in mid-April this year to announce modifications to the tests before waiting for the full review to be completed? And thirdly, he says in his statement on page 2, and I quote, "There would have been little value in examining a position from which the SNSAs had already moved on." Cabinet Secretary, I do not understand why you make this point when in mid-April your announcement was doing the exact opposite.
Cabinet Secretary.
First of all, can I say to Liz Smyth that David Reedy's review has done exactly what the Parliament asked us to do, which was to look at the evidence in relation to the educational evidence on this question. And that's the basis of my judgment. I'm interested only in whether there is educational value here. And the substantive, there's a lot of information covered in David Reedy's report, but one of the key points which I think is there is the important assistance the assessments provide in moderation across schools in Scotland to enable teachers to be confident about the judgment that they are exercising about the progress of young people, given the fact that the Scottish National Standardised Assessments, for the first time under Curriculum for Excellence, gives them an assessment which is related to Curriculum for Excellence and assists in providing them with confidence that young people are reaching the appropriate level that is envisaged in the early level of the curriculum. So that's just one example. And secondly, and also I would add to that, that David Reedy has spoken to many organisations and many practitioners and has seen practice in place, many of the organisations that Liz Smyth raised in her question to me in coming to this evidence report. The second point was about the P1 Practitioner Forum, and I believed it was important that I should respond as swiftly as possible to the views of practitioners in a body that I had established to hear practitioners' views, and if practitioners believed there were ways in which the assessments could be enhanced, we should take them at the earliest possible opportunity. And the third point that I would say, that I would respond to in Liz Smith's question, is the important point that I accepted in September of last year, that if there were specific educational issues that had to be addressed about the P1 standardised assessments, we should do that at the earliest possible opportunity. That is precisely why I've taken the actions that I've taken.
Ian Gray, to be followed by Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thanks to the Cabinet Secretary for early sight of his statement. The Cabinet Secretary says that this review does exactly what Parliament told him to do, but of course it doesn't. Parliament told him to stop P1 testing. And it may be that the Reedy review doesn't say that, but it does say that these tests need a clear rationale. They obviously don't have one. It says that these tests must not and cannot be aggregated to draw general conclusions or to compare schools or local authorities, yet the Scottish Government have repeatedly claimed that they can. The review says that the administration of the tests must be flexible, but we know that 80% of P1 tests were administered at the same time of year. The Reedy review says the P1 tests must be changed in order to align with Curriculum for Excellence. They clearly do not. So the review may say that the tests have potential, but its evidence says that Parliament's concerns back in September were well-founded. So what gives the Deputy First Minister the right to traduce those concerns, to ignore that decision and to defy Parliament's will?
Cabinet Secretary.
I've accepted that there has to be a clear rationale about these assessments, and David Reedy reinforces the argument, which I've advanced to the committee, that these are assessments with a diagnostic purpose. That is their purpose, to assist pupils, assist teachers and pupils in identifying the progress that requires to be made. And I've accepted that there needs to be a clear rationale and for that to be embedded within these assessments. Secondly, Ian Gray says that the assessments are not related to Curriculum for Excellence. I have to disagree with him on that point, and Mr Reedy doesn't substantiate that point in his report. What David Reedy has said is that the literacy assessment would benefit from being shortened, and that is exactly what we will explore with the company involved. And the third point that I would say to Mr Gray is this. Throughout all of this, I've been interested in the educational arguments for standardised assessments. That's what I've been interested in. And Parliament in September, and this was the first paragraph of my statement, voted for a halt to P1 assessments, but then asked us to consider the evidence about how best to progress the assessment of pupils in P1. Now, I took a decision which I reported to Parliament in October to encourage the assessments to take their course to give us a second year of evidence. And then we've looked further at the evidence, and I've commissioned David Reedy to undertake that review, to give us that evidence, and I now present that evidence to Parliament. And what the evidence says is that there is a benefit, an educational benefit for these assessments. They should have their purpose clarified, but they should be maintained, and that's the Government's intention.
Ross Greer, to be followed by Tavish Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thanks to the Deputy First Minister for the statement and accompanying papers. Given the Government's primary objective for these tests is to inform teacher judgment, Parliament has still not been presented with compelling evidence that the P1 tests usefully inform that judgment. We have heard concerns from teachers, parents, education and child development experts about the negative effects of the tests and the confusion surrounding their introduction, though. In giving evidence to the Education Committee, the Deputy First Minister first claimed that the tests are formative, not summative. Later that same morning, he stated that the tests are somehow both formative and summative. So given that he's been unable to clearly explain the purpose of standardised tests himself, how does the Deputy First Minister expect teachers and parents who opposed P1 testing from the start to have any confidence in a policy that this government seems to refuse to drop?
Cabinet Secretary.
The first point I'd make is that I'm accepting today that there is a need to strengthen the rationale for the assessments. That was a point that came out of the Education Committee's inquiry, and I'm happy to accept that point. The second issue that Mr Greer raises is about the nature of how these assessments are described. And he accurately reflects the exchange that he and I had at committee, but I do want to put it into a little bit of context. I was asked whether the tests were formative or summative, and I said they were formative for all the reasons I've just explained to Ian Gray. But I also accepted the point, and it's just an acceptance of reality, that if you add up all the numbers, they inevitably become summative. But that's not their purpose. It's simply an honest answer to a question that I was asked in the committee. So let me be absolutely crystal clear with Parliament. These are formative assessments to inform teacher judgment, and I believe they add a valuable component, particularly on the question of moderation that I replied to Liz Smyth about, to support teachers in their professional judgment.
Tavish Scott, to be followed by Jenny Gilruth.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his statement? Can you explain to Parliament why he hired an academic from the English educational regime that nationalists condemn, from a country where high-stakes testing is the norm, to produce the arguments he wants? Can you illustrate how many more reports Parliament is planning to see when teachers, unions, parent groups and this Parliament all said halt the testing of 4- and 5-year-old boys and girls? Can you tell teachers in Primary 1 what their workload will now be, given all the more guidance he's now produced and the new action plan he's announced today? What's the increase going to be in their workload and in the bureaucracy they face every day? And if parliamentary democracy is so important, why is this government so determined to press on with these tests when Parliament said don't do it?
Cabinet Secretary.
First of all, I simply offered David Reedy's independent credibility as a leading expert on literacy and questions of literacy as justification for recruiting a man of significant independent educational expertise who's not got an axe to grind on Scottish education. So I simply invited an individual who's got an academic track record to provide us with some independent evidence. And let me place on record my thanks to David Reedy for being prepared to do so. Secondly, in relation to the points that Tavish Scott raises about Primary 1 teachers' workload, what I'm trying to do is to make sure that teachers have the ability to rely upon a substantive assessment that will assist them in the crucial role of moderating the educational performance of young people. And the steps that we're taking are to make that as convenient and as straightforward and as accessible as possible for teachers in Primary 1. And thirdly, Tavish Scott supported a motion which called on us, yes, to halt the assessments, but also to consider the evidence. And I've considered the evidence, and the evidence says that our assessments are perfectly valid to be taken forward as a rational contributor to assessing the progress of young people, and that's why I believe it's important to implement the view taken by Parliament in the fashion that I've set out this afternoon.
Thank you. All the parties have outlined their positions, so just questions from now on, please. Jenny Gilruth to be followed by Alison Harris. Jenny Gilruth.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Given that the standardised assessments replace what was already, how the Scottish Government will ensure they are not used in addition to those which existed previously, many of which were not benchmarked against Curriculum for Excellence?
Obviously, this has been a project in which we've had excellent cooperation with our local authority partners. Our local authority partners have been involved in all of the preparation of the standardised assessments. In a limited number of local authority areas, local authorities are continuing with the former assessments they undertook to give them a consistency check for future years. I think on a temporary basis that's an entirely reasonable proposition. But the Scottish National Standardised Assessments are relevant to Curriculum for Excellence and provide an opportunity for local authorities not to use other assessments. Scottish National Standardised Assessments are relevant to Curriculum for Excellence and provide an opportunity for local authorities not to use other assessments which have not been related to Curriculum for Excellence, and obviously we will work with our local authority partners through the actions I've set out in the Scottish Education Council, where local government are full partners with us in taking forward these issues.
Alison Harris to be followed by Tom Arthur.
Thank you. Despite this independent review, a survey from February this year revealed that 41% of teachers disagreed that the tests were beginning to inform teaching, and another 17% were unsure. That's nearly 60% of the teaching.
I'm not sure if Alison Harris was one of the members of Parliament who took up the opportunity to see a demonstration of the assessments. But what she would have seen in that was the diagnostic information which is generated on every child. And the feedback that I get from individual teachers is that that diagnostic information is quick and simple to consider and gives teachers an opportunity to judge whether or not the prevailing judgment in their view is accurate or whether there are issues which they believe require further investigation. So I think that's the opportunity that the diagnostic assessment provides for teachers, and obviously it gives that reassurance which I raised in my answer to Liz Smyth, that the teachers are seeing a position that is relevant to what is expected in the early years of the curriculum, and that's of benefit to the judgment, the professional judgment that is relevant to what is expected in the early years of the curriculum, and that's of benefit to the judgment, the professional judgment of teachers.
Tom Arthur to be followed by Mary Fee.
Can the Deputy First Minister outline how standardised assessments at Primary 1 can support teachers in closing the attainment gap in schools in my constituency of Renfrewshire South?
Cabinet Secretary.
Obviously, because the that will help teachers to undertake what is increasingly happening within Scottish education, which is a relentless focus on closing that gap, of identifying the obstacles that exist in young people's education and supporting them to overcome those obstacles. And that will apply in Mr Arthur's constituency in Renfrewshire South, and of course, because these are available across the country related to Curriculum for Excellence, it will apply in all other areas as well.
Mary Fee to be followed by Tom Arthur to be followed by Mary Fee. Mary Fee to be followed by Fulton McGregor. Mary Fee.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. David Reedy concludes it would be beneficial for these tests to continue, albeit with important modifications and the establishment of additional guidance and support for practitioners. Can the Cabinet Secretary give the Chamber some detail of the important modifications that are required and the timescale for implementation?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think perhaps the most important modification is in relation to the length of the literacy assessment. And that's something which we have to discuss with the company involved in the design and the delivery of the assessment. We'll do that as a matter of urgency, and of course I'll be very happy to keep Parliament informed on that specific point. The other important modifications will largely relate to the description and outline of the purpose of the assessments, and I think Mr Reedy gives us a really strong framework within which we can operate to ensure that at no stage could these assessments be viewed as high stakes, and that they are in fact low stakes diagnostic assessments, and I'm determined to make sure that's the characteristic that these assessments have.
And Fulton McGregor.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Deputy First Minister outline how the Scottish Government can ensure that all local authorities, including North Lanarkshire, integrate the standardised assessments with a play-based learning approach for all primary ones?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think I'm really anxious to separate out two issues in this question, and I think these issues have become somewhat conjoined. One issue is about the importance of a play-based curriculum for young people, and that is at the heart of the early level of Curriculum for Excellence. And there is nothing, absolutely nothing, in the statement that I've set out today that compromises that play-based curriculum. David Reedy helpfully makes the distinction between between a play-based curriculum and what he calls a moment of assessment. At some stage, assessment will be undertaken for children who are involved in a play-based curriculum. David Reedy correctly characterises how that can be undertaken with the Scottish National Standardised Assessment, but I do want to make it absolutely crystal clear today that the Government firmly believes that a play-based curriculum in the early level is an absolutely vital foundation of how young people acquire their learning at that stage in their educational development.
Thank you very much, and apologies to Joanne Lamont, Oliver Mundell, Rona Mackay and John Mason, as I'm afraid we're just too pushed for time this afternoon. We've got 2 bills to get through, and that concludes this statement. We're just going to pause as we turn to the next item of business.
Time is tight, so I'm moving on to the next item of business, which is a debate at stage 3 on motion 17566 in the name of Kevin Stewart on the Fuel Poverty Targets Definition and Strategy Scotland Bill. Members will recall that following consideration of amendments last Thursday, the presiding officer indicated he had determined that no provision of this bill relates to protected subject matter. Therefore, the bill does not require a super majority to be passed at stage 3. I therefore call on Kevin Stewart, Minister, to speak to and move the motion. Minister, 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm very pleased to be opening this debate on the Fuel Poverty Targets, Definition and Strategy Scotland Bill. From the outset, the bill has been a strong and ambitious piece of legislation, and it has been improved through the legislative stages, through building consensus across Parliament and through consultation and engagement with stakeholders. We have established a challenging but importantly achievable target to reduce fuel poverty to no more than 5% of households by 2040. And we have changed the fuel poverty definition, ensuring a much closer alignment of fuel poor with income poor households. And in the illustrative draft fuel poverty strategy, we have shown both the scale of the task ahead as well as some of the ways in which we can bring about change through taking actions across all 4 drivers of fuel poverty. I have some thanks to make, Presiding Officer. I'd like to very much thank all the officials who have been involved in the bill, particularly my excellent bill team and my private office. They should be proud of the role in this bill today. I'd also like to thank the Local Government and Communities Committee, James Dornan, Alec Rowley, Graham Simpson, Annabel Ewing, Kenny Gibson, Alexander Stewart and Andy Whiteman for their input as we have moved forward. Their scrutiny and engagement at stages 1 and 2 has improved the bill, and I appreciate their constructive input throughout. Their Stage 1 report included a number of recommendations that I was happy to act upon at Stage 2, which have undoubtedly improved the bill. Other members, particularly Jackie Bailey, Liam MacArthur and Alasdair Allan, have paid close attention to the bill, and I want to thank them for their contributions. Our positive dialogue has led to amendments that we have agreed on and have improved the bill. In light of the positive changes this Parliament has made at stages 2 and 3, I believe that it would be useful for me to give an overview of precisely where we are actually at. The first thing to note is that the singular fuel poverty target, originally within the bill title, has now become multiple targets. The single metric of the proportion of households in fuel poverty in 2040 has been joined by targets for those in extreme fuel poverty and for the median fuel poverty gap with interim targets to get us there. On top of this, we have had the 2040 targets extended to each and every local authority area in Scotland. Of course, none of the Bill's targets will have any meaning unless we have a comprehensive and accurate picture of fuel poverty throughout Scotland. To that end, I believe the proposed new definition puts us in an excellent position. As I said earlier, the definition ensures a close alignment between fuel poverty and relative income poverty through the introduction of the income threshold based on the UK minimum income standard and the use of after housing costs income. So whereas under the current definition, only around 60% of fuel poor households are also income poor, under the new definition, the proportion rises to over 70%. The proportion of households in fuel poverty in both social and private rented sectors also show significant increases, alongside a rise in the number of families recorded as being fuel poor. These are the kind of households whose circumstances are often poorly captured by the current definition. The more balanced picture of fuel poverty that the new definition presents has been further refined by innovations, including Jackie Bailey's amendment for disability benefits to be deducted from a household's adjusted net income. The definition of extreme fuel poverty was one of the other major additions at stage 2, coming in response to stakeholder input and the recommendation of the committee. And to complement it, we added in specific targets to reduce it. Remote, rural and island communities are at the heart of the other major change which we introduced at stage 2. That is the uplift to UK minimum income standard for households in these types of area. And in preparing the detail of our proposals, my officials worked closely with Professor Donald Hirsch of the Centre for Research and Social Policy at Loughborough University, Loughborough, I'll say that again, whose team is responsible for producing the UK-wide minimum income standard. I'd also like to express my thanks to him for his invaluable contribution. The initial reactions that I've heard from rural and island stakeholders to our new uplifts and also to our comprehensive island communities impact assessment for the bill have been very positive indeed. Finally, Presiding Officer, the decision to create a new statutory Scottish Fuel Poverty Advisory Panel was another measure recommended in the committee's Stage 1 report, and I was happy to support the subsequent amendments from Alec Rowley, which we improved upon further last week. To conclude, I believe the bill is in excellent shape and will help ensure that the blight of fuel poverty is tackled with the seriousness and consistency of effort that it demands. I'm also pleased that this bill has shown how working together with members from all parties, discussing issues in advance and reaching a consensus has delivered improved legislation. We can be proud that this Parliament is world-leading with this legislation. Scotland is only one of a handful of European countries to define fuel poverty, let alone set a goal to eradicate it. Achieving the target will place Scotland amongst the very best in the world in terms of tackling fuel poverty. In that light, I move that the Parliament agrees that the Fuel Poverty Targets, Definition and Strategy Scotland Bill be passed.
Thank you very much. There is no time in hand, but I'd ask those members who wish to speak in debate to press the request to speak buttons now. I'll call Graham Simpson, to be followed by Alec Rowley.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I got a little bit confused at the weekend when I was thinking about this debate. A Twitter announcement from the SNP said, "Here's what we're doing in government to make Scotland a fairer place to live," with a downward arrow pointing to a list of alleged achievements, the first being passed world-leading legislation to tackle fuel poverty, which is what I thought we were here for today, Deputy Presiding Officer. In any case, I'm not sure the phrase world leading is appropriate for a bill that started out at just 6 pages and was a lukewarm replacement for what we were originally promised, which was a warm homes bill. I said during the Stage 1 debate that the bill originally lacked ambition. I had some pretty harsh words for it, and they didn't go down well with everyone. My good friend Kenny Gibson got himself in a bit of a tiz, I seem to recall. He's not here just now to confirm that. One of the criticisms of the bill was its target of reducing fuel poverty to 5% within 21 years. Now, some have argued that's too far in the future, but now that we've amended it to include interim targets, I think we can be comfortable that at least we have something that's achievable, and that's important. On a visit by the Local Government and Communities Committee to Stornoway, one of the bill's serious omissions was brought home to us, an omission that, when using the minimum income standard referred to by the Minister to define fuel poverty to reflect the higher costs incurred by people living in islands, remote towns and remote rural areas. Fuel poverty rates in urban Scotland have improved since 2015, but rates in rural areas haven't, so there's a widening gap. We faced a legislative vacuum and said so. And thankfully the government listened and amended the bill accordingly at Stage 2. One of the things I think we must ask ourselves when making law is this: will this make a difference to anyone's life? And if the answer is no, then you'd be right to wonder why on earth we would spend any time on it. And I think the bill was in that sort of shape when introduced, but we have a very different beast now. And that's down to people cooperating across party lines and coming up with sensible proposals, as well as some not so sensible ones. Now, Andy Whiteman has brought forward amendments to keep the focus on all 4 drivers of fuel poverty. We will now have the Scottish Fuel Advisory Panel. The Labour Party introduced this to the bill, and it's a welcome addition. The panel will be an independent advisory panel that will keep the pressure on government. The panel will analyse the periodic reports that have been produced by the government and give their own views on the progress that has been made and whether the fuel poverty targets will be met. It will be a statutory consultee. It's a significant layer of scrutiny that was previously lacking. Thankfully, the government's decided that the funding for the panel can be much higher than originally suggested by Alex Rowley, at just over 4 times. They're to be congratulated on that. It'll make a significant difference to the tackling of fuel poverty and will keep the focus and scrutiny on meeting and hopefully exceeding the targets. The government also listened to calls to target extreme fuel poverty specifically. Stage 2 amendments defined extreme fuel poverty and set both a final and an interim target for it, as well as for fuel poverty. This will prevent people living in extreme fuel poverty being left behind, a fear many of us had with the target as it was originally published. As I said earlier, the government's also listened to concerns about the higher costs of energy for people living in island and rural communities. I also felt strongly that the hard-to-reach homes in Scotland should not be forgotten about when dealing with national targets, so I introduced amendments that were accepted at Stage 2 and some minor changes at Stage 3, whereby the government must be seen to be working to reduce fuel poverty in each local authority level, and for the fuel poverty targets to be targets at the local level. But I was very careful not to place the onus on councils. I didn't want a national figure which ran the danger of overlooking areas such as our islands where fuel poverty is high and harder to combat. I now believe that a bill that was once lacklustre and unambitious, in my view, is focused, strong and achievable. And I think that's what we all want here today. Presiding Officer, if this bill is passed today, which I hope it will be the result of nearly a year of scrutiny. It's a very good example of committee working, of parliamentarians being listened to. There were areas of disagreement, of course there were, but we're in a good place, and this is a bill which can change lives. And if I can take one thing from the whole experience myself, Deputy Presiding Officer, it is not to get on the wrong side of Jackie Bailey on anything.
I desist from commenting. I now call Alec Rowley to be followed by Andy Whiteman. Mr Rowley, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In opening for Labour today, can I say that we will be voting for this bill, mainly on the grounds that any target is better than no target. We know that the last target set here in this Parliament, which was to eradicate fuel poverty by 2016, was not achieved by successive governments. The aim today of getting fuel poverty down to 5% by 2040 is of small comfort for those who are currently living in fuel poverty. As such, we believe we should, across this chamber, be more ambitious for Scotland to tackle fuel poverty. Should we at least not try to be bolder with tackling fuel poverty and work together to do all that is necessary to eradicate it? I had hoped that we could find that consensus to be more ambitious for the target, but as we saw last week, the SNP and Tory MSPs across this chamber teamed up together to vote down the more ambitious target of 5% by 2032. Now, the argument...
James Dornan.
Will Mr Rowley accept that he did sign up to the Stage 1 report?
This matter was raised, Presiding Officer, at the Stage 2 after the Stage 1 report, and my answer then is the same answer as I'll give Mr Dornan today. I have listened to organisations up and down Scotland and people living in fuel poverty up and down Scotland who say that the 2040 target is not ambitious enough. And surely that's the job of politicians in this chamber, to listen to what people have to say. Now, the argument that comes from the SNP and the Tories are built around the Scottish Government claiming to not have access to all the drivers of fuel poverty. And second, they say that there will be new technologies needed to have that have not yet been developed. When it comes to income, they say that we have no powers. But as Norman Kerr from Energy Action Scotland said when given evidence to the Local Government Committee, and I quote, "The Scottish Government may not have access to all the drivers, but it has access to some that would certainly mitigate fuel costs in particular." On the question of being more ambitious and aiming for a 2032 target, Mr Kerr had this to say. He said we need to scale up ambition. We could all say that 2040 sounds absolutely fine, but that would not give a step change in productivity levels or in the numbers of homes that are to be tackled each year. In all honesty, he continues, it condemns another generation to live in fuel poverty. The 2032 target is based on what we can reasonably expect in a number of parliamentary sessions and with an increase in budget. And that point about budget is, for me, key. For if we're to have any chance of tackling fuel poverty within the levers that are within our control, then there must be an increase in the levels of funding. We are nowhere near the levels of budget that will be required to tackle the levels of poor housing. It is about time that the government wake up to this fact and acknowledge what is needed to be done. If they want to be ambitious for Scotland, then they need to be bold, put the money in and not rely on the Tories to kick fuel poverty into the long grass. This point was made by Mr Kerr when he talked in the evidence session about insulating homes against rising costs, pointing out that the more energy efficient the home, the less energy it will use. Now, a report earlier this year from KPMG on behalf of the Scottish Government said that 1.8 million homes failed to reach the EPC rating C benchmark in 2016. So if we were to meet the 2040 target, then that would equate to roughly 66,000 buildings requiring major improvement each year over the next 2 decades. Of course, in order to achieve this, it will require much more funding than is currently available, which perhaps goes some way as to explaining why the Tories and SNP are so unambitious when it comes to fuel poverty. In the social rented sector, landlords have been required for some time to improve energy efficiency. We should do that in the private rented sector. Let's be more ambitious and let's tackle fuel poverty once and for all.
Thank you. It's regrettable we actually have no spare time. I call Andy Whiteman to be followed by Liam MacArthur. Mr Whiteman, 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm delighted to speak in this debate and to have contributed to the work on the bill through its parliamentary stages from its introduction about a year ago. I also want to thank stakeholders, people like the Existing Homes Alliance, Energy Action Scotland, Di Alexander and others who have engaged very constructively with this bill, and also to my local government colleagues, the Clerks and Spice, during Stage 1 and Stage 2. I think the bill has been quite a collegiate process, and I commend the way in which the Minister has positively engaged with myself and colleagues in other parties to improve the bill, because I do think we have actually pushed the ambitions of this bill further, particularly on the matter of scrutiny of securing the target. It is disappointing, it remains disappointing that this was not a warm homes bill, as the SNP manifesto promised, but this debate is nevertheless an opportunity to reflect on where we've got to with this legislation. And it is encouraging, following Stage 2, we now have a bill that I think does its best to seek to eradicate fuel poverty in Scotland, although of course it is just setting out targets and definitions, and the real work in doing all of that will be in implementing the fuel poverty strategy and in partners and stakeholders in local government and elsewhere who have a big job to do over the next 20 years or so. And amendments, I think, proposed at Stage 2 have strengthened this bill, making it a far more robust piece of legislation. These include the provision of additional heating regimes lodged by Jackie Bailey, and despite being thwarted at Stage 2, she tenaciously pursued these at Stage 3 and persuaded the Scottish Government to make some amendments in that regard. And likewise, the cross-party approach has ensured that the 4 drivers of fuel poverty are in here, and I'm very glad they are, and I thank colleagues like Alexander Burnett, whose famous £60 million amendment fell, but nevertheless, and Alec Rowley, who helped to amend the section with their own important contributions. And I particularly pay tribute to Alex Rowley's amendment on the Scottish Fuel Poverty Advisory Panel, because one of the things we were quite clear on after Stage 1 scrutiny was that if this target was going to be achieved, and of course it might not be, but if it were to have the best chance of being achieved, it needed independent scrutiny of not only where we are with the target, but why we were there and what we might do in future. And I think the work of the Scottish Fuel Poverty Advisory Panel, which is now put on a statutory footing, will be critical, I think, to the meeting of these targets. So a good compromise is often cited as when both parties are dissatisfied with the outcome, but I don't think that's the case here. I think the cross-party working and engagement by the Minister and colleagues, particularly on developing things like the enhanced minimum income definition, definition of extreme fuel poverty, improved scrutiny of the fuel poverty strategy, elevating the role of the Scottish Fuel Poverty Advisory Panel, are all to be commended. And I think it's a good example, certainly given me some pleasure to have been able to work with colleagues to secure legislation like this. There are, of course, disappointments, Presiding Officer. It's disappointing that the amendment to be more ambitious in tackling fuel poverty in relationship to the target of 2032, we haven't been able to secure that. I think this does undermine the Scottish Government's assertion that its response to the committee report, that Scotland will be amongst the very best in the world in terms of tackling fuel poverty, and I think also does compromise the Scottish Government's recent climate emergency declaration, as this was the opportunity to tie the targets to other targets around energy efficiency. But we are where we are, and I think sincerely this is a very good bill nevertheless, and I and my colleagues will be supporting it at decision time. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. I call Liam MacArthur, followed by James Dornan. Mr MacArthur.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The choice of whether or not to heat your home or eat a meal is not one that anybody should have to face in this day and age. The sad fact is, however, that according to government statistics, around 613,000 households are estimated to be living in fuel poverty and 174,000 in extreme fuel poverty. It blights communities up and down Scotland, yet we know that those living in remote rural and island communities consistently experience the highest levels of fuel poverty and extreme fuel poverty. There are many reasons for this: longer, harsher winters, being off the gas grid, more hard-to-heat properties, lower average household incomes, higher costs in installing energy efficiency measures, all play their part in placing Orkney uncomfortably at the top of the pile when it comes to fuel poverty. That's why it was so disappointing that the original bill took so little account of the rural and island dimension to this issue. It also ignored the advice of the Rural Fuel Poverty Task Force and almost every individual and organisation working in this sector across the Highlands and Islands and other rural parts of Scotland. To his credit, the Minister listened to the case I made on behalf of stakeholders in those communities, a case that was supported by colleagues across the parties. The amendments that we were able to pass at stage 2 will, I hope, ensure the needs of those in remote rural and island communities are recognised and then met through the additional resources that inevitably will be required. Again, I wish to put on record my thanks to all those who helped build the case in Orkney, the Council, Housing Association and Thaw, but a special mention to Di Alexander, Chair of the Rural Fuel Poverty Task Force, who gave such compelling evidence to the committee and proved to be the most tenacious advocate for the communities he has served over many, many years. Of course, those were not the only changes made to the bill. Indeed, it was striking to me how progress was made in strengthening this bill, thanks to the efforts of each and every member of the committee and others besides. As a result, we have the Advisory Committee on a statutory footing, with scope for recommending that targets are made more ambitious. There will be a requirement on each local authority to make progress towards achieving those targets and interim targets so that no area or community is left behind. And there will be greater flexibility in assessing needs so that resources can be more effectively targeted and all 4 drivers of fuel poverty taken into account. For these and other improvements made to the bill, I'd acknowledge the efforts of colleagues from each of the other parties, as well as the Minister, who has worked, I think, constructively to reach agreement. Remains to be seen whether our failure to accept Andy Whiteman's amendment on the commencement comes back to haunt us, the revenge of the geek, one might say. But, Presiding Officer, it's important to bear in mind the benefits of reducing fuel poverty go far beyond simply removing the need for people to choose between heating and eating. All the evidence shows that lifting people out of fuel poverty helps improve their physical and mental health. Unsurprisingly, living in a warm, dry home helps increase educational attainment as well. Local jobs are created and sustained in the energy efficiency and low-carbon heat industries, while households have greater energy security and money to spend. And our ambitions for tackling climate change are also reliant on us making progress in improving energy efficiency of our housing stock. For all these reasons and more, the bill matters. In passing this much improved bill this evening, however, we'll have done only the easy part. We now need to make sure that it and the strategy make a real difference to individuals, households and communities that for too long have been blighted by fuel poverty. For now, however, I have pleasure in confirming that Scottish Liberal Democrats will be supporting the fuel poverty bill later on this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr McCarthy. I call James Dornan to be followed by Alexander Stewart. Mr Dornan, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm delighted to be given the opportunity to speak in today's important debate, a debate which further enhances Scotland's place as a world leader when it comes to addressing fuel poverty. Everyone, no matter their income and employment status, should be able to heat their homes and keep themselves and their families warm. It's absolutely unacceptable that people are still making that choice of whether to keep themselves warm or to keep themselves from being hungry. According to recent research, the UK is the second worst rate of excess winter deaths in Europe, with over 3,000 deaths each year caused by people not being able to afford to heat their homes. So this shows why we needed action. Indeed, the Scottish Government has already taken action, backed up by significant investment to improve energy efficiency, keeping homes warm and bills down. Recent figures show that 97,000 households in Scotland moved out of fuel poverty in 2015, and their figures are good. But of course, faced with high fuel bills, we know we still have much more to do to eradicate fuel poverty. Presiding Officer, as the convener of Local Government and Communities Committee, I sincerely like to thank all the members of the committee, the MSPs who came before us, those who submitted evidence, and the Minister and all of his officials. But I'd be remiss if I didn't thank the committee's clerking team, along with colleagues from Spice and Outreach, for all the fantastic work that they did to allow us to find out, A, the true impact of fuel poverty, and B, the best way to combat it. I think all the members would agree that the Minister throughout the bill's progress has been incredibly helpful, and I'm grateful for his cooperation over the last few months. The burgeoning bromance between him and the always constructive and cheery Graham Simpson has been a joy to behold. Turning to some of the amendments of the bill itself, I'm delighted that MSPs voted in favour of the Scottish Government's amendments which were moved on Thursday. Most of the amendments were technical or tidying amendments, many of which I know already had the backing of a number of MSPs. At stage 1, I expressed my own concerns that the Government did not accept the Committee's recommendation to place the Scottish Fuel Poverty Advisory Panel on a statutory footing, and I'm therefore really pleased to see the Government now supporting this. And on that note, I'd like to briefly comment on the Government's Amendment 60, Amendment 96, in the name of Alec Rowley, and Amendment 60A in the name of Andy Whiteman. I was pleased to see Amendment 96 pass, and indeed Mr Rowley's other amendments, making the panel a statutory consultee for both the strategy and preparation of periodic report. However, I couldn't support 60A in the name of Andy Whiteman. The Scottish Government supported the statutory panel as the cap meant administrative costs were not going to be excessive, and resources were focused on tackling fuel poverty on the front line, not backroom functions. Indeed, the Scottish Government's Amendment 60 introduces a new 3-yearly cost cap of £82,000 on the statutory panel, calculated on the basis of a similar-sized panel to the existing non-statutory body. However, there was a real risk with Amendment 60A that it would cost the public purse a lot of money that could otherwise be spent on improving people's lives at home. I was delighted to see the Group 2 amendments failing to garner the necessary support, and whilst I recognise that Mr Rowley's amendments were well-intentioned, the Local Government and Communities Committee scrutinised the bill carefully, took evidence from a number of people, and concluded that the 2040 target date was realistic and achievable. And Mr Rowley talks about increasing budgets regularly on a number of fronts, and particularly on this. But, you know, whilst we've got limited resources to create growing the economy, then we're going to have limited resources to be able to increase the budgets. And in my view, and that of the committee's report at stage 1, there really is no credible alternative plan that shows that bringing the target date forward 8 years could be achieved without major risk. It was even suggested that pushing for the earlier target of 2032 could in some cases actually lead to increased fuel poverty levels due to higher installation or operating costs for householders, or bring forward mandatory interventions in homes. An unrealistic target ignores the many concerns that have been raised, including from COSLA, which had said setting unrealistic targets is callous. And that was based on the fact that we, as Mr Rowley talked about earlier on, the earlier target of 2016, which we were absolutely at no stage ever anywhere near to completing. Presiding Officer, I'm very proud that we've reached this stage of the Fuel Poverty Bill. It says a lot for the maturity of this Parliament, Government Ministers and members alike, that we're on the verge of making this incredibly important bill law by working together. I look forward to decision time when we officially confirm the Fuel Poverty Target Definition and Strategy Scotland Bill, making it law so it can begin to benefit the lives of many Scots still suffering from the blight of having to choose between eating and heating. For me, this is a good day to be an MSP.
Thank you very much. I call Alexander Stewart to be followed by Jackie Bailey. Mr Stewart, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to participate in today's debate on the third stage of the Fuel Poverty Bill. The bill undoubtedly is a positive step forward in tackling fuel poverty in Scotland, and that's what we needed and that's what we require. It is concerning that estimates suggest that in Scotland today, a quarter of households live in fuel poverty, rising to over 50% of households in Orkney and Western Isles communities. Fuel poverty is driven by many factors, including energy costs, energy inefficiency, household incomes and energy use. And we have to acknowledge that we do not have control over all of those factors. The 2002 target set to eradicate fuel poverty by 2016 has clearly not been met. Government efforts have focused on improving the energy efficiency of homes, but rising energy costs have meant that fuel poverty levels are now significantly higher than they were set back in 2002. As we set out in our manifesto in 2016, we in the Scottish Conservatives are committed to reducing fuel poverty and ensuring that everyone lives in an easy-to-heat home. And to that end, the initial stages, we broadly support the bill as it goes forward. And we also support the recommendations from the Local Government and Communities Committee, which I am a member of. And I would thank everybody who gave evidence and all those who participated to ensure that we had a very positive dialogue throughout the whole journey of this bill. The bill takes on a very welcome approach, clearly setting out the revised definition of fuel poverty based on the calculation of minimum income standards and takes into account living costs. And that is very welcome. We also welcome the fact that the Scottish Government publishes the fuel poverty strategy and consults with those living who have lived in fuel poverty prior to its publication. In terms of amendments, we were not able to support Alex Rowley's that brought forward a target for 2042 because we believe that was unrealistic. And the 2032 was much more talked about throughout the whole process. And the amendment would require that there was more than 10% of households in Scotland were in fuel poverty by 2035. And to that 3% of households would be in extreme poverty. And the medium fuel cap would not be more than £300 in 2015 prices once inflation is taken into account. So as with Stage 2 amendments that included an interim target of 2030 of not more than 15% of households being in fuel poverty and no more than 5% of households being in extreme poverty. This will ensure that we continue to keep our momentum and ensure that we go towards the target of 2040. As we also ensure that local authorities want to play their part in addressing this issue, and we are therefore introduced the amendment to that to 2040 itself. And this would require councils to have their own achievements targeted by that timescale. We also support the section which was covering the Scottish Fuel Poverty Alliance panel, which covers ministers' duties to provide financial resources and to stipulate the total maximum cost of the panel allocated throughout the panel. So, Deputy Presiding Officer, in conclusion, I very much welcome the bill and I support what the amendments have put out and been outlined within this report and within this debate structure. Fuel poverty remains a massive issue for many individuals. We've already heard today that some people decide whether they heat their home or they feed themselves. And that in Scotland today is something that we have to acknowledge and we have to tackle. So it is a significant way forward. We have still a long way to go to ensure that we have that majority of people who feel safe and secure, but we can be proud of what we have put in place today, and I support the bill. Thank you.
Thank you. I call Jackie Bailey to be followed by Annabel Ewing. Ms Ewing is the last speaker in the open debate. Ms Bailey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Let me declare an interest as the Honorary Vice President of Energy Action Scotland. As the Minister in the first Labour-led Scottish Government, I was responsible for establishing the fuel poverty target. So let me start with a look back, because history is indeed always instructive. It was the Housing Scotland Act of 2001 that committed Scottish ministers to ensuring that by November 2016, so far as reasonably practicable, persons do not live in fuel poverty. Now, I think we all at the time felt that this was an ambitious target, but it was one that all the parties across the Parliament agreed on. Now, it isn't often that you find issues that transcend the political divide. So it is disappointing that with that level of consensus, we failed to meet that target. So, in reflecting on what happened in the past, to understand where we went wrong, it is good to look at that to understand what we need to do in the future. So in 2008, I came across a members' debate. MSPs then thought that the target was tough but achievable. Nicola Sturgeon, when she was Deputy First Minister, reconvened the Scottish Fuel Poverty Forum specifically to provide advice to ministers on how to refocus the policy and how to achieve the target. So at that stage, we were still talking about eradicating fuel poverty and achieving the target. In 2011, members of that forum were telling ministers, they were telling parliamentary committees, they were telling this chamber that unless there was a substantial increase in resource, we would fail to meet the 2016 target. The spending level, as I recall back in 2012-13, was 65 million. At that time, the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee said that it needed to be in the order of 100 to 170 million to achieve the target. If you strip away financial transaction money, which we know can only be used for loans, the budget now is still less than 100 million. Last year, it was underspent, something that was a feature in previous years. And I know it's difficult to put loans into a budget and expect them to all be fully utilised. So we do need an ambitious target. We do need a route map, which is the strategy for how to achieve it, and we do need the mechanism to monitor implementation closely. But we also need to have enough money in the budget to realise our ambitions. And I would be very interested to know if the Minister has assessed what it will take by way of budget to realise the target. Does he have an indication of what money is required so that we achieve the target by 2040? The bill has been improved by the Government, and it's been improved by committee and other members since its introduction, and I very much welcome that and the Minister's willingness to discuss changes. It will come as no surprise to him that I remain, however, disappointed that the target of tackling taking fuel poverty down to 5% by 2040 remains unchanged. It is genuinely, in my view, lacking in ambition. That's a reduction of just 1% a year and potentially condemns yet another generation to fuel poverty. I think the target should be 2032. And I'm genuinely sorry that the Government, aided and abetted by the Tories, I might add, has chosen to ignore the voices of experts in the field of fuel poverty, people like the Existing Homes Alliance and Energy Action Scotland, because they all evidence the need for a more ambitious target. Now, James Dornan, I thought, hit the nail on the head when he suggested that there was a burgeoning bromance between Graham Simpson and the Minister. It can be seen too in the planning bill. And I clearly frightened Graham Simpson. I'm so sorry about that. But let me say gently as I can to him. Interim targets are no substitute for ending fuel poverty a full 8 years earlier. It is slower than it needs to be. You can have interim targets for 2032 as well. No, I think we've heard enough from you
the member
already,
must
Mr.
now
Simpson.
conclude, and I'm not frightened of you, Ms Bailey.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I will conclude on that
Thank
point.
you very much. I now call Annabel Ewing, then closing speeches. Ms Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I am pleased to participate in this afternoon's Stage 3 debate on the Fuel Poverty Target Definition Strategy Scotland Bill. And upon reflecting on the legislative process with regards to this bill, I would like, in addition to thanking the Local Government Committee clerks and indeed Smyth, and thank them very much for all their hard work, I would also like to pay tribute to the way in which the Minister has conducted matters throughout the course of the bill. It really has been a constructive process, and it is clear that all members of the Local Government Communities Committee were full square behind the key principle underlying the bill. And that is, Presiding Officer, to set a target to reduce fuel poverty in Scotland. And the ambitious and realistic target agreed to by this Parliament is to reduce fuel poverty to no more than 5% of households by 2040. Much discussion, of course, has been focused on the target itself. And it should be recalled indeed that at stage 1 in our report, after having heard all the oral evidence and having studied all the written evidence received by the committee, all committee members across all parties supported the approach set forth in the bill, and I quote, "The committee understands that this approach is a pragmatic response to previous attempts to set a target which ultimately failed. We also recognise that reducing fuel poverty will lean heavily on applying technologies still in development and that it is realistic to build in time for those to come on stream." The committee went on to conclude, and I quote, "The committee therefore accepts the government's reasons for setting the target date at 2040. This acceptance of the main tenet of the bill was, however, conditional on the government bringing forward amendments at stage 2 on a statutory interim target. The government did so, and we have also seen this approach further strengthened at stage 3, with a further interim target having been agreed. At the same time, the Scottish Fuel Poverty Advisory Panel will be able, if circumstances permit, to propose an acceleration of the target. That, Presiding Officer, seems to me to be the best way to proceed, the pragmatic way to proceed, and reflects the approach, in fact, favoured by those who will actually have to deliver the fuel poverty strategy on the ground, including local authorities. And it is also, Presiding Officer, as a matter of necessity, the only approach open to us, given that 2 of the 4 key drivers of fuel poverty fall out with the absolute control of the Scottish Government, those being energy prices and household incomes. Concomitant with the target date is the key definition of fuel poverty itself, the focus being very much on those who are most in need. At the same time, it is to be welcomed that the Minister acceded to the committee's calls to set a separate target for tackling extreme fuel poverty, and provisions on enhanced heating for those with disabilities and long-term illnesses are also to be welcomed. And I too look forward to the work being undertaken to develop the fuel poverty strategy underpinning this bill. Presiding Officer, as I said at stage 1, it is absolutely unacceptable that people in Scotland, an energy-rich nation, are living in fuel poverty. And whilst we on these benches will use every power at our disposal to resolve that, it is self-evident that without control over all of our resources and over all of the levers of fuel poverty, that is to say, without the powers of a normal, independent country, we will continue to be constrained in what we can do. Something that the Labour benches seem quite happy to see continue and to see Tory rule rather than Home rule. That is as unacceptable to me as it is to an increasing number of people in my constituency of Cowdenbeath as well as across Scotland. For it is only with independence that we will see real social justice in Scotland. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. Closing speeches. I call Pauline McNeill to be followed by Alexander Burnett. Ms McNeill, 4 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, I welcome the reintroduction of a fuel poverty target, the previous one having been missed, and Scottish Labour support the bill. Also welcome the new definition and the work of the committee in amending the bill, I think, to make it a great deal better than it would have been. However, I am very disappointed at the narrow scope of the bill. I believe it should have been the Warm Homes Bill, and I believe that the bill, at least in passing, has to be part of a centrepiece of wider policy around warm homes. As the Minister said, it's a serious challenge, but all the more reason why I think it should have been wider in scope, because the First Minister herself last year said in announcing £54 million to help eradicate fuel poverty, she said, the investment highlights our commitment to tackle fuel poverty and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, recognising the important link. I do believe that the two significant amendments to the bill, the first is the change to the definition or the uplift for rural communities, is extremely welcome. I'm sure Liam McArthur doesn't need me to point out that in Orkney fuel poverty is as high as 59%, but I'm sure he'll welcome the fact that I've said it. It is one of the most significant amendments to the bill and most welcome. Secondly, the advisory panel gives me some hope that in the long run we can scrutinise how we are progressing with these targets, and I think it's a significant and very welcome amendment. But the evidence shows, and we all agree on this, that living in a cold, drafty home has a negative impact on people's physical and mental health and in children's attainment. And in Scotland, we live in a cold country. That speaks for itself. And increasingly, people probably feel the need to heat their homes most of the year. And it's a consideration, I think, in any policy looking at warm homes and reducing fuel. 4 drivers of fuel poverty: the cost of energy, energy efficiency of homes and how households use their energy and household income. I believe that all 4 of these drivers can be affected by both government action, government policy and legislation. The UK has the highest rate of excess winter deaths. It's the only figure I could find. It was a UK one, but we know that we still face excess winter deaths, and it's the worst rates across Europe. The wider issues that I do believe, and in my amendments to the bill, try to address that. The majority of consumers are still in standard variable tariffs. They are still paying way over the odds. I think certainly educating consumers about how they can change that is the role of government. I believe that vulnerable customers should have a programme designed for them, because energy companies are not doing enough. I believe they should be required to contact vulnerable customers. It could be a public information campaign to make sure that those customers are on the cheapest deals. In my last 40 seconds or so, Presiding Officer, I just wanted to mention the need to ensure that the centrepiece of the whole warm homes policy also focuses on the energy efficiency drive within homes. Prepayment meters is something I wanted to mention, because the poorest people are on prepayment meters and they face potential disconnections. Scottish Power has a pretty good policy on that. I think ministers should check to see whether all energy companies are adopting the same policy to make sure that poor people are not disconnected from their energy. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, I think the evidence of the success of this bill is in the detail. We need a higher dose of ambition. One commitment we will give the Scottish Government, despite our disappointment, is if you make this a centrepiece of wider action on what can be done. Sorry, that was my alarm going off.
I hope it wasn't your morning call. Was it telling you to finish?
Yes.
I call on Alexander Burnett. To be followed by Minister Kevin Stewart. Mr Burnett, follow that. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And I'd firstly like to note how pleased I am to see this bill finally coming through Parliament. Too often we focus on the small things, rightly so, but looking at the bigger picture, this bill is the first step to positive changes for many across Scotland. And so I'd like to join my fellow Scottish Conservative colleagues in welcoming this bill. And also, as usual, note members to my register of interests on this bill in relation to energy efficiency, property management and construction. Now, in Scotland, currently a quarter of households live in fuel poverty, with rural and island communities living with higher fuel poverty rates than urban areas. And as Existing Homes Alliance have noted, nearly 1 million homes fall below the energy efficiency standard needed for our health, and change has not been coming fast enough for people, therefore causing consequential health implications and cost to the NHS. Now, at stage one, we supported the bill and pledged to make amendments to strengthen it, and we were concerned that the bill did not outline how the Scottish Government would be held accountable if it did not meet the targets outlined, as well as how to address issues that affect islands and remote rural areas. So we were very pleased to have worked with members across the Chamber and that the Government have accepted amendments to align with their bid for homes to reach an EPC rating of C or above by 2040. Now, we would of course have wished for stronger EPC targets for 2030, but we do accept that adding in interim targets at 2030 and 2035 will also bring benefit. Now, as my colleague Graham Simpson said on Thursday, these interim targets will ensure that by 2030 we will see the overall fuel poverty rate to be less than 20%, and with a further reduction to less than 15% by 2035. And it will also ensure that the final aim of no more than 5% of households are in fuel poverty by 2040 is reached. So I was pleased to see that Amendment 72, in the name of my colleague Graham Simpson, was passed, and this required the strategy to set out the approach Scottish ministers intend to take towards all targets and interim targets in each local authority area. And with such varying differences in fuel poverty across Scotland, this is a much welcomed addition. Now, I note that Andy Whiteman said on Thursday, I will probably go down in history as a member who almost moved a £60 million amendment at stage 2, and I do not regret attempting to do so. In order for us to see any radical changes to fuel poverty levels and to create real change in reducing carbon emissions, we need to invest in improving energy efficiency levels now. And so to clarify members who may be simply looking at the cost, I was seeking to ensure that there was an actual identification of residential buildings and the work required in order to reach the EPC rating by 2030. Yeah, certainly.
Andy Whiteman.
Burnett for taking intervention and clarifying, in fact, his amendment was about the identification. Does he agree with me that actually there are much cheaper ways to make this identification in the standard EPC methodology, and there are also new technologies emerging, and that he should stick with it, and he'll have my support in pushing for better means of identifying the homes that are most in need of energy efficiency measures across Scotland?
Mr Burnett.
I think we can always look to improve the EPC methodology, and we're always welcome for discussions about how we can improve anything which ultimately benefits people in fuel poverty and in cold homes. Because this work will be required at some point, and the sooner it is legislated for, the better. And this is just an example of an issue that Scottish Conservatives and stakeholders alike have had with this bill, in that it doesn't go far enough and is not going to bring people out of fuel poverty fast enough. But nevertheless, it is a good first step to take, and I'd like to briefly note my disappointment that Amendment 77 in my name was not passed. This would have provided detail on the approaches that will be taken to remove poor energy performance as a driver of fuel poverty in order to meet the targets set. So, to end on a positive note, and as the constituency MSP for Aberdeenshire West, I'm pleased to see that this bill will look after remote rural areas. And by setting out a minimum income standard for these areas separately, it ensures that these communities are taken care of in a realistic manner. So overall, we welcome this bill and are committed to reducing fuel poverty, and this bill will begin the process of ensuring that. So as we stated in our manifesto, we are seeking this change to help households save on their energy bills, make homes easier to heat, create thousands of jobs all over Scotland, and all whilst reducing carbon emissions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now close on Minister. Kevin Stewart, close to the government. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's a bit strange having split this stage 3 into 2, and in the last debate being accused of compromising with Miss Bailey, and today being accused of having a bromance with Mr Simpson. I don't know what's going on here. I've obviously missed something myself. But after listening to the debate this afternoon, it's quite clear that members of all parties fully appreciate that it is absolutely imperative that we remove the blight of fuel poverty from communities throughout our country. And I firmly believe that the measures contained in the Fuel Poverty Targets Definition and Strategy Scotland Bill will ensure that we achieve that goal. The challenging yet realistic targets which the bill introduces will ensure that tackling fuel poverty remains a pressing issue for this and for future governments. And the new definition it creates will give us a better understanding of the nature of the problem that we've ever had before, helping us to develop a comprehensive strategy to solve it. Now, I know that in all of this, not everyone is satisfied. Some folk always want us to go faster. I understand that, and I understand the stakeholders who wanted to move quicker in that regard. But we also have to take cognizance that while some of the experts that Mr Riley mentioned said 2032, those folks who are delivering on the ground, people like COSLA and various companies, say that that would not have been achievable and that 2040 was the best date. Now, I'm always a man who looks for compromise, and that's one of the good things about the additions to the bill, because the panel itself will be able to look at whether or not we can move the target date to a nearer time. And, you know, we will keep a close eye on all of that. Also, of course, in Energy Efficient Scotland itself, we will continue to monitor how we are doing, what technologies have come into play, and whether we can up the ante in terms of driving forward quicker. I, for one, agree with everyone here today who has said that no one should have to make the choice between putting on their heating or eating. I think we all feel that way, and I think it's incumbent on all of us as we move forward to scrutinise how we are doing in that regard, and I'm sure, along with the panel, that will happen. Some of the other points that I want to touch upon relate to some of the things that folks have seen in their travels. Mr Simpson was talking about going to Stornoway. I myself have been to all of the islands and various other places to talk to people around about the changes that they wanted to see, which are now encapsulated within this bill. I know that some folk have already paid tribute to Di Alexander. I think he deserves the tributes that have been paid from folks in all parties around about his efforts. But we should also take cognizance of people and communities, people and organisations and communities who have made their voices heard, and their voices are now encapsulated within the bill. And beyond that, I don't think we've paid enough attention to this. This is the first bill that has been island-proofed. And I am very, very grateful to everyone who played a part in achieving that. And there are maybe lessons from this bill that can be picked up in other bills. Some of the debate today, Presiding Officer, has strayed on to the 4 drivers of fuel poverty. And some have picked up on the fact that we don't control all of those drivers. I'm pleased that Mr Whiteman and others at stage 2 looked at the 4 drivers in some depth, and that we as a Parliament and the committee in the future should look at all 4 drivers. What I would like to see, and I hope that we can work across the chamber, whether we're happy with the current devolved settlement or not, I hope that we can persuade the UK Government to look at energy costs, particularly in some of the areas that Ms McNeill mentioned in terms of prepaid meters, which I think are scandalous, and to do more when it comes to tariffs. And I think that we can work across this chamber together to try and persuade some of the changes that are required to be highlighted to the UK Government, and hopefully we can see change. I would like to see those powers coming here, but in the meantime, let's see what we can do together to actually make the change that is required. Presiding Officer, I see you staring at me. Does that mean that I'm almost out of time? Well, let me finish on this. Currently, there are still far too many people in our country struggling to afford to keep their homes warm. That's a situation that I find completely unacceptable, and hearing others today, I think we're all in agreement. It is clear that this Parliament thinks the same on this issue. Let us work together to make sure that we do all that we possibly can to take people out of fuel poverty in this country. This bill will help us bring that situation to an end, and I hope that everyone will support it here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. That concludes the debate on fuel poverty targets, definitions and strategy Scotland Bill. It's time to move on to the next item of business. We have a short pause to allow the front benches to take their places.
Thank you very much, colleagues. The next item of business is Stage 3 proceedings on the Human Tissue Authorisation Scotland Bill. And in dealing with this bill, members should have with them the bill as amended at Stage 2, the marshalled list and the groupings of amendments. And should there be a vote this afternoon, the division bell will sound, proceedings will be suspended for 5 minutes following the first division in the afternoon, and thereafter, the period of voting for the first division will be 30 seconds, and thereafter there will be a 1 minute period for the first division after debate. Members who wish to speak in any debate on any group of amendments should press their request to speak button as soon as possible after I call the group. So at this stage we'll turn to the marshalled list, and I call Amendment 1 in the name of the Minister, grouped with Amendment 2. Minister to move Amendment 1 and speak to both amendments in the group.
In moving Amendment 1, I'd like to thank Lewis MacDonald and David Stewart for bringing forward amendments at Stage 2, which related to the duties of Scottish ministers to provide information and raise awareness about authorisation and for transplantation. Amendment 1 draws together the overall intention of Mr MacDonald and Mr Stewart's Stage 2 amendments by setting out how ministers are to carry out their new duty under Section 11D of the Human Tissue Scotland Act 2006. That provision places a duty on Scottish ministers to promote information and awareness about how transplantation may be authorised, including in particular how authorisation for transplantation may be deemed to be given. The effect of Amendment 1 will be that this duty must be carried out at least once in every calendar year. It will also mean that when the duty is exercised, Scottish ministers must have regard to the need to provide information to the public about how authorisation of transplantation may be deemed to be given and how to give an express authorisation or to make an opt-out declaration. The amendment makes it clear that the Scottish ministers must have regard to the need to provide this information in healthcare settings. This could include, for example, providing information in GP surgeries or hospital waiting areas in line with the intention of Mr Stewart's amendment at Stage 2. Amendment 2 is consequential on Amendment 1. I therefore ask members to support Amendments 1 and 2.
Thank you very much. And I call Lewis MacDonald.
Very much, Presiding Officer. I welcome the Minister's amendment, which fulfils his commitment to refine the text of amendments passed by the Health and Sport Committee at Stage 2, and I welcome his willingness to seek agreement on this area. As he says, that's Amendment 1 and Amendment 2 is consequential on that. My amendment at Stage 2 was to commit ministers to an annual campaign to raise awareness of both deemed and express authorisation and opting out. David Stewart's amendment was to commit the NHS to communicate with patients about authorisation and opting out. I'm glad the Minister has engaged with Mr Stewart and myself on these matters, and his amendment here, or these two amendments, deliver on his commitment given at stage 2, and therefore look forward to supporting both the amendments in this group.
Thank you very much. And does the Minister wish to add anything by way of conclusion?
Nothing further.
Thank you very much. Therefore, the question is that Amendment 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Could I call Amendment 2 and ask the Minister to move formally?
Moved formally.
Thank you very much. The question is that Amendment 2 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 3 in the name of Lewis MacDonald, grouped with Amendment 4. Lewis MacDonald to move Amendment 3 and speak to both amendments in this group.
Thank you very much. The purpose of Amendment 3 is to require Ministers to review and report on the new system of authorisation 5 years after it comes into force, including a review of the Government's actions to raise awareness of the changes under the Bill in general. The Health and Sport Committee unanimously agreed this approach in supporting an amendment in my name at stage 2. Amendment 3 refines that approach and Amendment 4 is consequential. I am grateful to the Minister again for working with me on these amendments, and I believe that they deliver the shared purpose of the Government and the Health and Sport Committee. Amendment 3 provides that Ministers must review both the new arrangements for deemed authorisation and their own actions to promote information and awareness about the revised system of organ donation. The report must say whether the objectives of this bill have been met and whether family members have had the support that they need. This will allow Ministers and Parliament to make a judgment 5 years after implementation about whether the bill before us today has made the difference, which we hope that it will, and if not, what more at that stage might need to be done. And I move Amendment 3 in my name.
Thank you very much. And I call the Minister.
I support Amendments 3 and 4 lodged by Lewis MacDonald and would like to thank him for working with the Scottish Government to ensure that the proposals align with the overall aim of the bill.
Thank you very much. And no other member wishes to speak. Does Mr MacDonald wish to add anything?
I do not.
Thank you very much. Therefore, the question is that Amendment 3 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 4. Lewis MacDonald to move.
To move.
That is moved. The question is that Amendment 4 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are agreed, and that concludes consideration of amendment stage. Members will be delighted to hear. Now, before we move on to the debate at stage 3 on the human tissue bill, as members will be aware at this point in proceedings, I have to make a statement to decide whether or not, in my view, any provision of the bill relates to a protected subject matter, that is, whether it modifies the electoral system or franchise for the Scottish parliamentary elections. In my view, it does no such thing. Therefore, it does not require a supermajority to be passed at stage 3. So we'll turn to the stage 3 debate, and the next item, and I would invite all members who wish to speak in this debate on stage 3 of the Human Tissue Authorisation Scotland Bill to press their request to speak buttons as soon as possible. And I call on the Minister, Joe FitzPatrick.
Presiding Officer, I welcome the opportunity to open this stage 3 debate on the Human Tissue Authorisation Scotland Bill. I'm proud to have led this bill through the Parliament, but I want to start by recognising the work of my predecessors in relation to this bill, but also in relation to wider improvements in the transplantation landscape. Since the early days of this Parliament, there has been much discussion about the pros and cons of moving to an opt-out system. So at this point, I want to put on record my thanks to the bill team and officials who have got us to the stage of having a bill which I am clear will be a positive addition to the work which has also delivered so much progress over the past decade. I'd also like to thank the Health and Sport Committee for its consideration and sensitive approach to the scrutiny of the bill, reflecting their understanding of the circumstances in which organ and tissue donation must take place as a result of the incredible generosity of donors and their family. I also want to thank other members for taking the time to discuss their concerns with me, particularly Mike Rumballs, Jeremy Balfour, Gordon Lyndhurst, who lodged amendments at stage 2 facilitating further refinement, discussion and clarification of the operation of the bill. Presiding Officer, there is no one answer to increasing organ and tissue donation, and that is why we must continue to build on the measures which have been put in place over the last 13 years and to which this bill contributes. The primary aim of the bill is to introduce an opt-out system of organ and tissue donation for deceased donors. The bill amends the existing Scottish legislation that supports donation, that is, the 2006 Human Tissue Scotland Act, by introducing a new additional form of authorisation called deemed authorisation. In practice, this means that what this means is that where a person aged 16 or over was not known to have any objection to donation, donation may proceed. However, the bill also contains safeguards for those who would not have the capacity to understand deemed authorisation, or people residing in Scotland for less than 12 months who may not be aware of the system, who will not be subject to deemed authorisation. Key to the success of donation are donor families, and the way in which families are approached is a key part of that. The bill ensures that the interests and the views of the donor are safeguarded at all times by including a clear and effective mechanism to do this. There is a duty on health workers to make inquiries of families and others who are entitled to provide information reflecting the most recent views of the donor. I know that the committee was given a demonstration by the specialist nurses for organ donation on how the approach is made to families, and saw the sensitive and supportive way that the family is guided through the process at such a difficult time. This is a real strength of the current system, and that approach will continue under the new system. There is a high awareness of donation in Scotland, and one of the areas which has raised a lot of discussion in committee and during the Stage 1 debate is the importance of information and awareness. I welcome that the duties to promote information and awareness in the bill have been strengthened by the amendments developed in collaboration with Lewis MacDonald and David Stewart. And I want to reiterate to the Chamber our intention and commitment to fulfil those duties. We are committed to an awareness-raising campaign for at least 12 months during the lead-up to the introduction of the opt-out system. We will take time in the lead-up to that period to work with communications experts and representative groups to ensure that information is accessible to different groups in the population, including hard-to-reach groups, minority groups and those with specific needs. In addition to the multimedia activity being planned, there will be a direct mailing to all households in Scotland in the lead-up to the introduction of the system. This will explain the change in law, including, amongst other things, how a person can opt in or opt out of donation. The secondary school education pack, which is highly regarded as good practice, will also be updated and disseminated. We are also exploring how information can be provided to young people reaching 16 years of age so that they are aware of the opt-out system and can make an informed choice about their donation decision. We will continue to work with Kidney Research UK to train the volunteer peer educators who are a valuable resource, raising awareness of donation and transplantation amongst ethnic minority groups. In this respect, I am delighted that Kidney Research UK have invited officials to speak about the opt-out system in July at their conference with imams to raise awareness about donation and transplantation. This bill makes an important contribution to developments in donation and transplantation, and I want to thank the experts in the NHS who have guided us through the sensitive and complex issues of the process, working with us to develop a legal framework for authorisation for donation that respects this. As we move towards introduction of the opt-out system, we'll be working with the NHS to ensure that the NHS systems are developed and those working in donation and transplantation have the necessary guidance and training needed to deliver the new system safely and successfully. The work to increase donation and transplantation will not stop with the passing of this bill. As less than 1% of the population will die in circumstances where donation is possible, it is important that we continue to find different ways to make progress. In closing, I want to be clear when we talk about progress what that means to the lives of those awaiting transplant. Members might not know the name of Gordon Hutchison, but they might recognise him from his scar. Gordon has featured as part of the donation campaign in Scotland for the last 6 years. Since his transplant as a child, he has gone on to live a full life. He is married and recently become a proud father of a baby girl. On his transplant, Gordon has said, The life I lived before the heart transplant compared to my life now is night and day. My organ donor saved my life. Presiding Officer, for the many people awaiting a life-changing transplantation operation, I move that the Human Tissue Authorisation Scotland Bill be passed.
Thank you very much, Minister. And I call on Miles Briggs to open for the Conservative Party.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And for the many families and campaigners across Scotland, today is an incredibly important day. Every day in the UK, 3 people die waiting for a new organ. In Scotland, as has been outlined already, 500 people are currently waiting for a transplant that will and could save their lives. Across the UK, Scotland has the highest proportion of people on the organ donor register, but has the lowest rate of family consent, and also the lowest rate of organ donation. Now, given the gift of life is an extraordinarily special thing for someone to do following the death of a family member, and I would like to pay tribute, as the Minister has, to those who have already taken the decision, not only to join the organ donor register, but the work that their family have to undertake to make sure that their wishes are taken forward. And that is at heart what we are trying to achieve today, to make it easier for an individual to express their personal wishes and to start a national conversation on organ donation. And I'd like to pay tribute to those who have also worked on the bill, both in past parliaments as well as in this parliament, including Anne McTaggart and Mark Griffin. I'd also like to thank those who have given evidence and met with the committee, the Health and Sport Committee, during the course of our inquiries. And I think I speak for all members of the committee when I say their personal experiences have stayed with us and helped to take forward and shape suggestions to how we believe as a committee the bill can be strengthened and improved. And key to success of the organ donation, of any organ donation, as the Minister's outlined, is the experiences of families and friends that can ultimately help improve decisions and actually the experience at what is the hardest time for anyone can imagine. Presiding Officer, during our time in scrutinising the bill in Parliament, the experience in Wales was raised repeatedly, and it's clear that there have been significant positive progresses made in Wales, and that can be helping to change and improve our own system here in Scotland. In Wales, family consent has increased from less than 49% to 70% following the introduction of an opt-out system in 2015. This is welcome progress, and I hope we will see the same realised soon here in Scotland. Presiding Officer, there is a specific issue, though, which I hope members still believe needs to be addressed in relation to the provision of intensive care beds across the country, especially in Highland and south of Scotland. Scotland has the lowest number of intensive care beds anywhere in the United Kingdom. I know this was an issue highlighted by the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh at stage 2, and I know my Health and Sport Committee colleague David Stewart has also raised this issue. Now, as the bill has progressed, both of us, I think we're mindful to try to bring forward amendments with regards to this in the bill, but I don't think that would have been useful or appropriate for this bill. It's an issue I still feel, though, we need to see further discussion and clarity around on the Scottish Government's commitment and further proposals, as this will ultimately, I believe, affect the potential success of the bill. Now, I welcome the Minister's constructive approach to working with the committee on this issue, but I'd also like to see further details and assessment of future staffing and provision of intensive care beds and a commitment to keep this under review as the bill goes forward. When I've met with people who have received a donation, the clear message that they give me is they believe that the collaborative approach between the organ donation teams and families has literally made a life-saving impact. And I'd like to also add what the Minister said to thank them for their work. One donor can save up to 9 lives and transform even more by donating tissue. Thanks to the generosity of donors, their families and the work of our NHS, we've seen great progress on organ donation over the last few years. And I hope the Minister will provide and make sure that the campaign he's outlined is innovative and positive, so that we can have a positive public information campaign that will actually capture the positive spirit of what it is to be a donor and what the families have expressed during our time during the committee. Because we need to work to continue to progress and increase donor numbers and save the lives of more people across Scotland and the UK. And I believe this bill can and will deliver on those two main aims, the further increased donor numbers while honouring donors' decisions and the decision they've taken during their life. Presiding Officer, I know from speaking to those who've received an organ and their families just how incredibly thankful they are to individuals and donors and also their wider family. It genuinely is sometimes a situation that cannot be put into words by donors and their families, and what it means for someone's son or daughter to have been saved by a total stranger. I hope the passing of this legislation today will help take forward a positive national conversation for donors as well. Finally, I'd like to conclude with the words of 57-year-old Steve Donaldson from Largs in North Ayrshire, who had a heart transplant in 2010 after suffering severe heart failure. He waited 9 months on the organ donor transplant list before a suitable donor was found. And in the briefing provided by the British Heart Foundation for today's debate, Steve said, "My message to everyone is please sign the organ donor register. Have the conversation with your family about your wishes. It can really make a difference." Presiding Officer, as a Parliament, we are currently debating and passing so many pieces of legislation, not as efficiently as we have today, maybe, but none, however, can be so important and make such a life-changing impact than the passing of the Human Tissue Bill today. And I think that's something we should all rightly be proud of. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now call on David Stewart, open for the Labour Party.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And this, of course, is crucial legislation. How do we raise the level of organ donation in Scotland to match the needs of those desperately awaiting transplantation? The principles of this bill have been broadly accepted across the political divide, notwithstanding the lodging of a number of amendments designed to improve and indeed develop the legislation. So I acknowledge the help of the Minister and his officials with my amendment, which is now in Joe FitzPatrick's name, but I could stress that no copyright fee is required in this situation. Scottish Labour have long been supportive of soft opt-out for organ donation, and we're glad to see that Scotland is finally moving to adopt such a system. Now, credit should be given to the individuals from across the political divide who have consistently campaigned for this change. In particular, we are thanks to Scottish Labour's Anne McTaggart for her proposed Members' Bill in the last session, which, although unsuccessful, significantly moved the debate forward. And I would like to personally acknowledge the contribution of Mark, who has done such a fantastic contribution in this as well. And I know he's got a big family relationships there. So it's Mark Griffin, of course. Wales, of course, have led the way in this issue. And though it's still relatively early to assess the impact, there are positive signs of increased levels of family consent and donation. We must learn from the experience of implementation in Wales, including the importance, as the Minister said, of resourcing the public awareness and information campaigns. Now, Scottish Labour's successful amendments at stage 2 have raised the awareness-raising element of the bill by requiring annual campaigns. We also established a 5-year assessment of changes so that there's a clear learning on the effectiveness of implementation and improvements in organ transplantation. However, the bill will not be the only change. This bill will not be the only change needed to increase transplantation rates in Scotland. Going forward, the Scottish Government need to ensure that there is sufficient investment in Scotland's infrastructure to support the increase in organ donation. As we've heard from previous speakers, including the Minister, 426 patients died in the UK whilst on the transplant list or within 1 year of removal in 2018. And as we heard from Miles Briggs, Scotland is the highest percentage of people on the organ donation register, but the lowest actual organ donation in terms of rates per million. Family authorisation also is low in Scotland. So the key issue, Presiding Officer, is the gap between those who wish to donate organs and the number who actually go on to join the organ donation register. 80% support donation, only 52% have signed up to donation register. So in simplistic terms, the purpose of the bill is to bridge the divide, to encourage those who support organ donation but haven't registered in ODR to have their wishes recorded and respected. And let me tell you about my friend Gary. He is in his mid-50s and lives in Glenlosses in Fife. Nearly 2 years ago, he was given the gift of life by a crucially needed heart transplant. Prior to that, he was on the transplant list for 12 months and had a pacemaker, but he slowly deteriorated. Without the transplant, he would have died. Gary cannot praise enough the dedicated support of the nursing staff at the Golden Jubilee. He said to me, it was a matter of life or death. We also need to look at international evidence and best practice. That's absolutely crucial. Now, we know from the background research by the British Heart Foundation that people living in countries with soft opt-out were more willing to donate their organs. So in general terms, soft opt-out means that unless the deceased has expressed a wish in life not to be an organ donor, consent will be assumed. Now, of the top countries, the top 10 countries in terms of donors per million, 9 have an opt-out system. Now, as I mentioned at the stage 1, this brings us to Spain, who lead the World League table for organ donations. Now, we took evidence at the Health and Sport Committee on this point. Why are they so successful? And I know the Minister's got a big interest in this. Well, there's 3 main reasons. They have a comprehensive network of transplant coordinators, they have a donor detection programme, and they have a greater provision of intensive care beds. Could the Ministers wind up comment on this? Bearing in mind it's not a zero-sum game, we must also be concentrating on increasing the number of intensive care beds, as well as looking at the changes in consent. Now, very briefly, I'm conscious of time, Presiding Officer, during the stage 1 debate, I spoke of 2 issues raised by the Law Society, and I raised this at the last issue, so the Minister has some advance warning. They raised the issue, is deemed authorisation consistent with the Montgomery ruling, which is Montgomery versus NHS Lanarkshire, which was the Supreme Court case around informed consent? And is the bill consistent with the European Convention on Human Rights, specifically the case of Elbert versus Latvia, 2015, which was found to be a breach of Article 8, which is the right to privacy? However, I do believe, Presiding Officer, that the 5-year review will allow considered reflection on the above points. In practice in the future, what assessments made about medical professionals will in fact take into account the wishes of the whole family. However, I believe this is a vitally important piece of legislation and will be a matter of life and death for many Scots, like my friend Gary, desperate in need of life-saving organ donation. As Cabran once said, you give little when you give of your possessions. It's when you give of yourself that you truly give. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now call on Alison Johnson to close for the Green, open for the Green Party.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to begin by thanking all of those who have campaigned for this change over many years. And I'd like to thank the RCN, the BMA, the British Heart Foundation and the Law Society of Scotland for their briefings for today. But I also would like to express my gratitude as well to Mark Griffin for his lengthy campaigning on this issue, and to Anne McTaggart for her work in introducing her bill in 2015. Although it ultimately didn't win support in Parliament, I think it's been a key impetus for change. The policy memorandum for the bill today reminds us that organ and tissue donation and transplantation is an incredible development in modern healthcare, which continues to save and to significantly improve lives, and the Greens strongly support the intent of this important bill. It also reminds us that organ and tissue donation and transplantation is dependent on the generosity, the commitment and the skill of a number of people, and I'd like to thank them all. We already know, we've heard in this debate again today, that Scotland does well in terms of donor registration, and that 52% of people in Scotland have signed up to the organ donor registration, the register. But while this percentage is the highest in the UK, there is a persistent gap. David Stewart spoke of it strongly, that gap between this figure and the approximately 80% of people who support organ donation. A new poll released today by the British Heart Foundation has also revealed that 7 in 10 people in Scotland back the proposed changes to organ donation law. So the will to donate is clearly there, and I'm hopeful that this bill will help to tackle the disparity between people's intentions and the actual number of donations. Now, family authorisation for organ donation in Scotland is the lowest in the UK, and this results in the loss of approximately 100 potential donors every year. And this bill can go some way towards rectifying this, as evidence from elsewhere in the UK suggests. In Wales, family approval for organ donation has increased from 49% to 72% since introduction of the opt-out system, and I'm therefore optimistic that a similar pattern will begin to emerge in Scotland, and that the number of family consents will rise, which in turn will lead to an increase in donations. But during the stage 1 debate, I, with others, have highlighted that an opt-out system on its own isn't an instant solution. It has to be part of a broader strategy to increase donations. And I am pleased, therefore, to see a duty placed on Scottish ministers to annually provide information to the public about how to opt in or to opt out of the system. It's ultimately preferable to maximise the number of people opting in, as this will remove any ambiguity about the patient's wishes and hopefully allay family members' concerns about going against these. And healthcare professionals must also be given comprehensive guidance about the changes to organ donation proposed by this bill. The Royal College of Nursing has revealed that only 25% of its members feel they can speak with confidence about organ donation with patients and their families. So there's still much work to be done to raise awareness amongst healthcare professionals. The College has called for an education programme for all healthcare professionals, as well as ensuring that we have sufficient resources for education and training of the wider nursing workforce to support a shift in the culture of conversations on donations. It is really important that we empower our healthcare professionals to speak confidently to patients about organ donation and to address any concerns or fear that the change in legislation may cause. I'd like to close by thanking the BMA for sharing a number of personal stories about organ donation today. I'd like to focus on the words of Jill Hollis in particular. The lung transplant I received in 2004 took me from being close to death to living again. My transplant was the most amazing gift, and I have nothing but gratitude for my donor family and the medical team. I'm hopeful that this bill will lead to more stories like Jill's and enable more people to give the gift of life. Thank you.
Thank you, and I call Alex Cole-Hamilton to open for the Liberal Democrats.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. That keeper of organisational memory in parliamentary history, Mike Rumbles, remarked to me just a few moments ago that he thought that this Stage 3 proceedings was some kind of record in the swift way in which we dispatched with all the amendments. And I think that speaks to the brevity of this proceeding, speaks to the consensus that has been built around this bill. And as Alison Johnson said, however, it didn't happen in isolation. So I too want to reflect on the contribution both of Anne McTaggart in the last session and indeed Mark Griffin, who I think it's fair to say held our committee and the government's feet to the fire in the early days of this Parliament to ensure that we got to this day. So I want to thank him very much indeed for getting us to this point, and indeed the government for making good on their commitment to do so. It is an emotional day for me. It's a joyful one at that as well. When I was, as I said, at Stage 1 proceedings, when I was an aspirant political candidate, as I'm sure you all were one day as well, in Hastings we were often asked what your private member's bill would be if you made it to the Scottish Parliament. And as I said at Stage 1, Deputy Presiding Officer, this would be that bill. And that came from a lifetime of understanding about the needs of organ donation and the paucity of organ donation that has until now existed in this country. And that was because my good friend Anders Gibson, who suffered from CF, I grew up alongside with an expectation that his life would always be cut short. It is to my great sadness that Anders didn't live to see this day, that his lung transplant, when it came, ultimately came too late and didn't properly take. But I speak in his memory today, and I know that he is looking down on us and with great pleasure at what this Parliament is about to do. Organ donation is vitally important. There isn't enough of it, and that is why I was keen to host a reception and a photo call earlier this year for Give a Kidney UK. They're a philanthropic kidney donation organisation of people who give altruistically of healthy kidneys to complete strangers, completely out of the will to be philanthropic and to give life to others who might have to suffer protracted periods on dialysis or even life limitation. So I want to salute them in this debate today as well. But it is in the foothills of our preparation around this legislation that I learned the full extent of what actually goes in to the process of organ donation. And it was our great privilege, I'm sure I speak for all of the committee today, when I talk about our experience of meeting with the specialist organ donation nurses, who are angels, heaven sent, and a credit to our National Health Service. They talked about using the rather onerous bureaucracy, which I think was quite shocking to members of the committee to see how many intimate questions were asked of a soon-to-be deceased relative in their final hours by loved ones literally at their bedside. But they talked about turning that process into the telling of a life story, into finding mirth and merriment in what for everyone concerned would be somewhat their darkest hours. We met with transplant recipients, and I think that's when the idea of organ donation as being gift was really struck home. Just the sheer magnitude of that present that somebody had given in the last hours of their life to that somebody unknown to them who would go on to live a happy and fulfilling existence off the back of the organs that they received. But with that, we also learned about the roller coaster of emotions that goes with that. And Anders had that too, when he had a couple of false starts, being driven to Newcastle and returned when the transplant fell through. And I hope the Minister will address those points in his remarks and talk about the mental health support that we can give to those people who are on transplant waiting lists. We need also to recognise that this is just one aspect in encouraging people to have those conversations, because those conversations are going to be absolutely important going alongside this bill. And if I can finish on this quote, Presiding Officer, from the Chief Executive of the British Heart Foundation, Simon Gillespie, who said, this is about, there is a desperate shortage of organ donations. Introducing an opt-out system will better reflect the views of the general public and give hope to those currently waiting for transplant they so desperately need. We support this bill.
We now move to the open debate. Speeches of 4 minutes, please. Emma Harper, followed by Lewis MacDonald.
Presiding Officer, I am pleased to be able to speak in support of Stage 3 of the Human Tissue Authorisation Scotland Bill this afternoon. From the outset, I empathise that 500 people in Scotland are waiting for a transplant at any one time, showing the need for this Parliament to take this action and support this bill today. As Deputy Convener of the Health and Sport Committee, I have had an opportunity to carry out much of the scrutiny of the bill at Stage 2, and I thank all of those who have provided briefings for this bill throughout its progression in Parliament, including the organ donation nurses, Anne McTaggart and Mark Griffin, who is in the chamber this afternoon. All of those who have provided evidence to the committee, including the BMA and all the other professional organisations, are welcome as well. As a former nurse and liver transplant team member in Los Angeles, California, I was especially grateful to hear from the people who were either waiting on an organ or those who were transplant recipients. I've heard many pre-transplant stories from patients who are about to be the recipients. The personal voices of the recipients and people waiting for organs was vitally important in helping to inform committee members, and I thank all who came to speak to us. It is useful to again stress that the bill's principal aim, which I'm pleased the Parliament overwhelmingly supported at Stage 1, is to bring about a long-term culture change to encourage people to support organ and tissue donation by, number 1, registering on the organ donation register, and number 2, moving to a soft opt-out system. Presiding Officer, just over half of Scotland's population have already registered to donate their organs or tissue after death, reflecting both their incredible generosity and the progress made in highlighting the need for organ donors, which is absolutely welcome. However, if we are to achieve the aim of reducing the number of people dying as a result of the unavailability of organs, then we need more people to register. Most organ and tissue donations can only occur in tragic circumstances, and only 1% of people die in situations where there could be an organ donor. Given this clear need for more organs to save lives, this bill will therefore introduce the deemed authorisation for deceased donation where an adult has not clearly opted in or out. What this means is that when someone dies and have not made their wishes on donation known, their consent to donation would be presumed, and conversations regarding commencement of donation processes could occur. Presiding Officer, the committee received evidence and submissions from some who were concerned that the bill, because of the deemed consent element of the bill, meant that people's organs would be donated as they had not opted out, but, for example, they'd never got round to it. But this argument would assure people that the bill includes safeguards to ensure donation wishes of the deceased are followed. The bill also provides a legal framework for pre-death procedures which facilitate successful donation for transplantation so that people are educated and encouraged to make their wishes known. This section of the bill addressing opt-out declarations made by an adult can be found on page 16. Presiding Officer, the committee received a number of submissions and indeed heard evidence from people who were concerned about a lack of public awareness of this change in legislation, which was originally a concern for me. So I'm therefore very pleased that the Scottish Government has committed to continuing to deliver high-profile awareness-raising activity every year as set out, promoting continued national conversation. The Scottish Government's campaign, We Need Everybody, launched in July 16, has been a success, leading to increases in the number of people joining the organ donation register. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, being probably the only person in this chamber who has held a kidney, a pancreas, a liver and a heart in my hands for them to be placed into another person, I encourage all to consider registering to be a tissue and organ donor and to offer this gift to save someone's life. And I urge all to vote in favour of this bill this evening. Thank you.
I call Lewis MacDonald to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you very much. This bill gives us a fresh opportunity to maximise organ donation to help some of the hundreds of people waiting for organ transplants that can save their lives. Instead of presuming that people do not want to donate their organs after death unless they've opted in, we will now presume they do want to donate unless they've opted out. That change is made within the framework of the law as it stands. This bill amends the Human Tissue Scotland Act 2006. It is evolution, not revolution. I welcome that in this case, not least because I took the current law through Parliament and I believed then that it laid the foundations for whatever evolution in the law might be needed in future. Before 2006, people did not authorise transplantation of their organs after death, they consented to it. The difference between consent and authorisation is not just a word. Authorisation makes the law far clearer than it was before in requiring that people's wishes on these matters should be followed. The 2006 Act also called for a concerted effort to tell people how authorisation works and to explain the difference organ donation could make, and successive governments have delivered that. Scotland, as a result, achieved the highest rates of authorisation in the UK over several years, now as high as half the adult population, although, as others have said, that is not the whole story. The 2006 Act was also designed to enable the further development of the transplantation infrastructure in Scotland. And as a number of members have said, the Health and Sport Committee heard impressive evidence from specialist nurses for organ donation about how that all now works. But despite all that progress and despite our high rate of opting in, Scotland also has the highest rate of bereaved relatives saying no to organ donations. And health professionals are understandably reluctant to challenge their right to do that at what is already a very sad and stressful time for those families. So the law should not seek to reduce families' right to be heard, nor should it compromise the duty of care which doctors and nurses owe to the bereaved at the time of death. What this bill seeks to do instead is to widen the pool of people from whom organ donation may come. We are, as we've heard, following the lead taken by Wales in 2015, and a similar change will happen in England in 2020. Rates of donation in Wales have now overtaken those in Scotland. The Welsh bill in 2015 was itself the trigger for increased public awareness, although it took some time for this to result in increased rates of organ donation. But that is now beginning to happen, and the time is right for us to follow that lead. Like others, I want to thank my colleague Mark Griffin and my former colleague Anne McTaggart for their efforts to bring forward the principle of opting out in place of opting in. And the Scottish Government has now enabled that principle within the framework of the existing law and, as we have seen today, with very broad cross-party support. Passing this bill can help increase rates of donation and save lives, but changing the law will not be enough in itself. Today's amendments have mandated ministers to use this bill to raise awareness, to encourage people to authorise donation, even though deemed authorisation is now in place, and to strengthen further the transplantation infrastructure in Scotland. And we have also agreed that ministers should review this legislation in 5 years' time, including how it has been communicated. We should also, finally, renew the promise which Parliament made in 2006, that we will give these measures every support to achieve the change that we want to see. But if Parliament needs to return to this topic again in future, it should not hesitate to do so.
Kenneth Gibson, followed by Mike Rumbles.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It is a pleasure to speak in this debate, knowing that at decision time this Parliament will, I believe, vote for a bill that MSPs past and present, third sector organisations such as the British Heart Foundation, healthcare professionals and indeed patients themselves have long been calling for. This bill, like Anne McTaggart's Members' Bill proposed in the last parliamentary session, is intended to increase the availability of organs and tissue for transplantation and therefore reduce the number of people waiting for a transplant. At Stage 1, members shared moving stories of loved ones or constituents who waited too long for an organ and the grave consequences that can have. Indeed, almost 600 people are awaiting a potential life-saving organ here in Scotland. If this bill can achieve any reduction in that number, it is something we all can and should get behind. Under this bill, there are three key provisions: opting in by explicitly stating your authorisation to donation, opting out by explicitly removing authorisation, and deemed authorisation the default option if someone has not recorded their wishes. In developing this soft opt-out system, we can more easily capture the estimated 80 to 90% of Scots who support organ donation, while closing the gap between the number of people who state that they would wish to donate and the number who actually join the organ donation register. As an overwhelming majority of people would wish their organs donated, it can be surmised that many of the 48% of Scots who are not registered donors simply have not got round to opting in. This legislation will help capture these folk who have the potential to save lives by donating their organs and tissues. Of course, individual choice must be protected. That's why this bill introduces a soft opt-out, incorporating safeguards and conditions that might include seeking authorisation from a person's nearest relative in cases involving certain groups or people or specific circumstances. Deemed authorisation will not apply to under-16s, those resident in Scotland less than 12 months and those without capacity. This is not about asking the family for their views or overriding the wishes of donors. It is about asking them what they believe were the views of their deceased relative. Unfortunately, just 57% in 2017-18, Scotland has the lowest level of family authorisation in the UK. I'm glad, therefore, that the Scottish Government took an evidence-based approach to resolving this. There is strong evidence to suggest that legislation like this will improve levels of family authorisation by encouraging frank conversations between relatives about their wishes. Indeed, people living in countries with opt-out systems are between 27 and 56% more likely to authorise donation of their relatives' organs. That has absolutely been the case in Wales, where consent rates rose from 49% in 2014-15 to 72% now, and I hope to see a similar uplift here in Scotland. I'm grateful to the Health and Sports Committee for their excellent work in scrutinising this bill and strengthening it at Stage 2, specifically their amendment to place a duty on Scottish ministers to promote an annual awareness and information campaign ensuring regular opportunities for people to make or review their decision to donate or not, and today's amendments also helped. We know the power this can have. Indeed, the duty on Scottish ministers to promote awareness about donation in the Human Tissue Scotland Act 2006 resulted in year-on-year increases in people recording their decisions on the organ donation register. This bill will have an even greater impact. And I'm certain deemed authorisation will drive a long-term increase in support for organ and tissue donation. Presiding Officer, perhaps even the progress of this bill through Parliament has inspired more people to discuss donation with loved ones. That can only be a good thing. Of course, the ability to transplant is always reliant upon the medical viability of organs, which this bill cannot legislate for. At Stage 1, the Minister highlighted other work this Government is undertaking to increase the number of viable organs, such as providing funding for new technology to improve patient outcomes receiving liver transplants and increase the proportion suitable for transplantation. That is work to be commended and built upon going forward. I close by paying tribute to everyone who donated and every family that supported and facilitated those donations, saving and improving lives. That is truly a gift, one that this bill will help bestow on many more untold lives going forward.
I now have Mike Rumbles to be followed by Christine Graham. 3 minutes each, please.
I'm convinced that if we pass this bill at decision time, then there will be a greater chance of saving lives. So why was I the only MSP to vote against the bill at Stage 1? Let me explain. I've been on the organ donation register myself for the last 20 years, and it's heartening to see that a majority of Scots are now on the register too. And this has come about through many measures, not least through the Act we passed here in 2006, as previously mentioned by Lewis MacDonald, in which we focus on the wishes of the deceased rather than the wishes of his or her nearest relative. So when I first saw this bill after publication, I was, I have to say, perturbed that the safeguards in it were not sufficient in regard to the wishes of a potential donor. By that I mean that it seemed to me that there was a danger that the wishes of the potential donor might in some cases be ignored. There was one phrase in the bill which I thought could undermine the success of the legislation. The bill originally said in section 7 that deemed authorisation does not apply if a person provides evidence to a health worker that would convince a reasonable person that the adult was unwilling for the transplantation to take place. So the evidential bar for the family of the deceased to confirm the wishes of the deceased was being raised unnecessarily. The Welsh and English legislation does not do this, and in my view there was no need for our legislation to raise the evidential bar in this way. At some future date, if this had not been changed at stage 2, I was concerned that if, even in one case, the nearest relative of the donor could not provide evidence that would convince, and donation went ahead against what the relatives believed were the wishes of the deceased, then we could see this legislation undermined. Now, I am very pleased that Joe FitzPatrick, the Minister for Public Health, has taken on board the point I've been raising, and he brought forward government amendments to alter the bill which have the same effect as the amendments I was happy to withdraw my own at stage 2. So now in the bill, if a person provides evidence to a health worker that would lead a reasonable person to conclude that the adult's most recent view was that he or she was unwilling for the donation to take place, that would be acted upon. I've only got 40 seconds. With this safeguard now in place, I am more than happy to support the bill at decision time and want to place on record my thanks to Joe FitzPatrick, who was willing to take my concerns on board and change the wording of the bill. With only my vote against at stage 1, he wasn't under any real pressure to change the bill. But he took the time and he made the effort to get this right. Presiding Officer, I wanted to put my thanks to Joe FitzPatrick on the record, and I also want to thank you for providing me with the opportunity to do so in this debate. Thank you.
The last of the open debate speakers is Christine Graham. 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I say to the member that I abstained at stage 1. I support organ donation and carry a donor card and would encourage others to go in the register, and much in the bill is commendable. However, 3 words do not appear in the bill: donation and presumed consent. These have been displaced by transplantation and deemed authorisation respectively, and I ask myself why. I suggest that these are used to assuage any concerns members may have, because donation requires the owner of something to voluntarily transfer it to someone else, a gift. You cannot gift if you are dead and have not registered as a donor. Presumed consent is a prime example of oxymoron because consent cannot be presumed. It has to be indicated in some form or other, no matter how minute. The blink of an eye in response to 1 blink for yes, 2 for no, that will do. So, in my view, that's why organ donation and presumed consent have been rebadged as transplantation and deemed authorisation. The greater deceit is to try and say deemed authorisation is different somehow from presumed consent, although Emma Harper transposed the two, and she's quite right. If I consent to hitting me with a brick, the same will result from authorising you to do it. I will still have been hit by a brick. Consent, authorisation, one and the same. Neither authorisation nor consent can be presumed or deemed in the vital absence of any indication either way, and in my view it is wrong for the state to do so on behalf of a silent deceased. So while I fully support the intent of the bill, with regret I cannot support this legislation as it is worded, just because it's well intended, and I do understand that, and I do want people to have access to organs. But this bill, as it stands, I cannot support, and accordingly, I will not support it at decision time.
We now move to the closing speeches, and I call David Stewart. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This has been an excellent debate with well-informed and thoughtful contributions from across the Chamber. I believe the key point, echoed by several members, was that this is crucial legislation. How do we raise the level of organ donation in Scotland to match the needs of those desperately awaiting transplantation? Miles Briggs, who's absent from his place as I speak, made a tribute to those on the organisation register and, of course, their families. And I think he's right to say we need to start a national conversation. I think he's also right to thank all those that give evidence to the Health and Sport Committee. I also believe it's important we do analyse the experience in Wales, albeit it's still relatively new. And I think, to summarise Miles Briggs, he said, where Wales walks, we follow. I also believe he's correct to say we should also be looking at the provision of intensive care beds. Alison Johnson made the important point that organ transplantation is a vital development of scientific healthcare, and that there is a will to donate in Scotland, as clearly evidenced in polling, and of course family consents will rise. But having the wider strategy of analysing on an annual basis opt-in and opt-outs are clearly important. Alec Cole-Hamilton conceded that before he was elected, his wish for his member's bill would have been organ donation. So I think that was a very genuine point. And he also made the very vital point that the gift of giving is something that's always been there. We always should remember that. And I agree with him that praising the organ donation nurses, which we in the Health and Sport Committee met, was very important. And I think telling the life story of donors is something we should never forget. Emma Harper, as an ex-nurse, obviously has had tremendous experience here. She did talk about the safeguards in the bill for pre-death procedures, the need to raise awareness, and I accept that the Minister has taken on board an amendment in this front, and I would congratulate the Government for the work they've done on We Need Everybody campaign. Lewis MacDonald talked about the fresh opportunity to relaunch organ donation, and we should, of course, never compromise family rights. We need to widen the pool of organ donation, and that awareness raising needs to be highlighted, as it has been within the amendments, and reviewed within the amended legislation. So in closing, Presiding Officer, I believe the stakes are very high for the success of this legislation. More than 1 in 10 people on the waiting list will die before they get the transplant they need. As BMA Scotland have said, the bill will change the culture and philosophy within society so that donation becomes the norm. So we need to aim for societal change where organ donation becomes an accepted fabric of our national life. The greatest gift you can ever give is the gift of life itself. Thank you.
Now call Brian Whittle. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And I'm delighted to be closing this Stage 3 debate in behalf of the Conservative Party. And as you would imagine at this stage, it's been a very consensual debate given the topic. And I think, as has been said before, it's a very swift passage is testament to the work done previously by Anne McTaggart and Mark Griffin, who's in the Chamber today. I think I would start with by saying that during the Health and Sport Committee investigation, as many members have highlighted, and the Minister himself highlighted, and quite rightly so, the incredible work the specialist nurses do in dealing with the bereaved family in their time of grief. I know all my fellow committee members were moved by the demonstration of conversation between the nurses and the next of kin, and the number of questions, I think, as Alex Cole-Hamilton alluded to, I think surprised us all. That number of questions is certainly a lot to be tackled at a time of grief. But I think the delicate and empathetic way in which they deal with the subject of organ donation with the bereaved is a testament to their skill and dedication, and we would all want to give them our thanks. I think it's fair to say there was much discussion and debate in the Health and Sport Committee during the passage of the bill through those committee stages. I don't think speaking against the bill, rather the nuances around the bill and its potential implications. Now, far be it from me to in any way praise Keith Brown, but I thought I might do, see if I could ruin his reputation here, because I was always exercised the way he consistently pressed for the rights of the donor and that their wishes should be paramount. However, I think the need for the next of kin to answer that complex set of questions on the deceased prior to any donation will always have that final veto to the family. I know Mike Rumbles was also speaking about this in his closing, so I'm not sure there's any way around that. But I think that I think Keith Brown certainly got us to think quite in depth about that. I think, as any healthcare professional will not go against the wishes of the family, irrespective of the donor's wishes expressed or presumed. Now, as has been said here, 9 out of the 10 top countries in terms of transplant data use a form of opt-in. However, I think the implementation of an opt-out system in of itself will not necessarily increase the number of donors. Spain, as an example, has been raised by David Stewart and among others. But in what he was suggesting was that in every hospital in Spain, they have a capacity and an expertise in organ transplant. And I would ask what the plans the Scottish Government have to ensure that any increase in organ donation is matched by that increase in capacity. In these days of multiple shortages in staff across many disciplines in the NHS, I want to ask the Scottish Government if it's confident that it can recruit the prerequisite number of specialist nurses in our hospitals and make sure they're equipped with the acute specialist facilities necessary. And perhaps I would join David Stewart in asking the Minister if he perhaps address that in his closing remarks. I've also spoken about my reservations in the bill that having both presumed and expressed consent could lead to confusion. I think Scotland has the highest level of card-carrying donors in the UK, but also the highest level of family overrule. Alison Johnson, Dave Stewart again, and Miles Biggs have highlighted there are 40% of the population who would donate but haven't yet expressed that consent. Now, I was one of them until recently, and it was only in changing my address and my driving licence that I was prompted online to express that consent. And it took little more than a minute to complete. Now, I would advocate more opportunities to express consent because, in my mind, that is a much more powerful declaration than any presumption. However, the bill does offer the opportunity to bring the topic to the nation's attention. I did catch part of BBC Scotland discussion, a radio discussion this morning, and that is exactly what they were talking about. So it does work, and I think that in itself must be a good thing. I think instigation of conversation in families where their thoughts and wishes can be expressed has to be positive, as Kenny Gibson said. So in supporting the bill, the Scottish Conservatives would ask the Scottish Government to run a consistent marketing campaign alongside implementation of the bill to ensure maximum understanding of express consent. And finally, Presiding Officer, we would also ask that an audit of the current number of intensive care beds and specialist staff be undertaken with a plan put in place for that potential increase in donors as a result of this bill. Donating organs is an incredible legacy to leave, and the passing of this organ donation bill sees the accumulation of many years by campaigners, and we would hopefully have the impact that we all think it can. Presiding Officer.
I now call Joe FitzPatrick to wind up the debate for 6 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, I want to thank members for what has been a very good debate on a very complex and sensitive subject. Particularly thank members from across the chamber for reading out some of those names and some of those statements from people who have benefited from organ transplant, because it's really important that we hear those true stories, and I'll hopefully have time to talk about some of the stories that I've heard and some of the people that I've met today. Donation, of course, can be a very personal issue, although there are, I think, some differences of view on moving to an opt-out system. I'm sure we all agree that it's important that we do all we can to support initiatives that aim to increase donation. Moving to an opt-out system, as this bill will provide for, will add to the initiatives that have been driving improvements over the last decade and have been leading to that progress which I spoke of earlier. And it's hoped that this change will contribute further to those ongoing positive developments. These developments are supported by commitment on the Scottish Government to support and promote donation, but have been driven forward by those who work in the system, and I want to put on record my thanks and admiration for their dedication. Overseeing the process, the Scottish Donation and Transplantation Group has played a key role in ensuring that opportunities to improve donation and transplantation are maximised. The group has also provided valuable insight on the bill to ensure that it provides for a system that will work in practice. I'm grateful for that input and know that the group will continue to play an important role as the new system is implemented and monitored. Miles Briggs, David Stewart and at the end there Brian Whittle asked about infrastructure and capacity, and the Scottish Government has an ongoing commitment to ensuring that the infrastructure supports donation. Performance is continuously monitored and potential improvements are considered via the Scottish Donation and Transplantation Group, which, as I said, oversees the delivery of the current plan for donation and transplantation for Scotland from 2013 to 2020. As part of the plan for increasing organ and tissue donation, the transplantation in Scotland from 2020 onwards will discuss with stakeholders whether there are further initiatives which should be progressed to improve the infrastructure for organ and tissue donation going forward. And I think that's very important. David Stewart again raised the issues of human rights legislation, and I can assure members that we've worked with those who work in donation and transplantation to ensure that we have a system which will work in practice, which also clearly takes account of a person's rights, particularly under the European Convention of Human Rights. I think Mr Stewart mentioned briefly the Montgomery case, and the legislation is in line with their decision, but that was more about the concerned to medical treatment, whereas this bill is about authorisation of donation. I think I want to finish, if it's okay, I've got a few points, and there's another point that the member raised. So the member went on to specifically ask about the Latvian case, Elbert, and the outcome of the Elbert case, which Mr Stewart has raised before, turned on its own particular facts and circumstances, and the issue was the quality of the Latvian organ donation legislation, which gave family members a right to object to donation, but provided no mechanism for that right to be given effect in practice. So the judgment doesn't suggest that a right to be consulted is a necessary feature of an opt-out system. It simply illustrates that if there is a right is provided for, it must be capable of being exercised, and that was where the Latvian law fell short. Very briefly, because there's lots of other points.
I'm very grateful. The point I raised was Elbert versus Latvia 2005 case. The case was proved as a breach of Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. My point is that if we're having a 5-year review, it will be the courts that decide whether there's a breach. Does the Minister agree that in the long term that's the best way to proof this legislation?
Excuse me, Minister, could we quieten down the chamber, please?
I think the member is absolutely right. I think we're absolutely comfortable that looking at the case law in Elbert in particular, that we're content that the bill is absolutely solid in this area, but he's absolutely right that the 5-year review allows that further examination. Alison Johnson asked about staff training and education and awareness, and I think it is a very important point. Training for those involved in the donation and transplantation process will be a crucial part of the successful implementation of the new system. Alex Cole-Hamilton asked about psychological support for patients and donor families, a point that he's raised before. So National Services Division is responsible for commissioning all of the psychological support in the pre and immediate post-transplant phase, and it's currently reviewing the provision of psychological support across all nationally commissioned specialist services, including organ transplantation, to ensure that appropriate provision is in place. And we understand that the review will be completed later this year. So I think that is an important point. I think Mr Cole-Hamilton also mentioned support for families, and we do recognise the selfless decision donor families have made, and specialist nurses do direct families to bereavement services where appropriate. But I think it's important to note that for many donor families, donation is seen as a positive outcome out of a tragic situation. It's a legacy for their loved ones, which can be a valuable part of their bereavement journey. Kenneth Gibson mentioned a range of other work that is improving donation, and he is absolutely right. I've been clear that opt-out will only deliver the increases in donation that we all want to see as part of a package of measures. Kenneth Gibson also talked about the frank conversations that people should have with their loved ones, and having those discussions about donation with loved ones will make it so much easier for family to make that decision comfortably, and to have those conversations with the specialist nurses should you die in tragic circumstances, so that your organs can then save a life. So I think it is really important. There's one message from today's debate, I would really encourage everyone to have those conversations and speak to their family about what their wishes would be. Very, very quickly, Presiding Officer, Christine Graham mentioned and talked about consent versus authorisation. I think actually Lewis MacDonald answered that point in his contribution. The wording relates back to 2006. In closing, Presiding Officer, this morning, I want to go back to why we're doing this. And this morning, I was at the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh and I saw firsthand the difference donation can make when I met two organ recipients, Jamie and Claire. They spoke of the life-changing gift they had received and the difference it had made to their lives. Of her transplant, Claire said, waking up, I was like a different person. It's impossible to explain. Even though there have been some ups and downs with my recovery, my life is better than I could have expected. Jamie was equally grateful and said, it's an amazing gift. It's the gift of life. I will never be able to meet the person who did this for me, and I'm not sure I'd know what to say to them if I did. It so completely changed my life. I think we need to remember that that is why we are doing this. I'm so proud, Presiding Officer, to commend this bill to the Chamber today. Like the 2006 Act before it, it will provide the basis for further progress, and I move that the Human Tissue Authorisation Scotland Bill be passed.
Thank you very much, Minister. And that concludes our debate on the Human Tissue Bill. Before we come to decision time, the next item of business is a Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee debate on motion 17529 in the name of Bill Kidd on standing order rule changes. And could I call on Bill Kidd to speak to and move the motion?
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. The Commission on Parliamentary Reform was established to look at how the Scottish Parliament can engage better with the people of Scotland and how our work here can be improved to deliver better scrutiny. The SPPA Committee and the Parliamentary Bureau have both been responsible for implementing some of the Commission's recommendations. And the Committee has now identified some changes to standing orders which are required, and these are set out in our committee report, but I'll give a quick outline of them at the moment. First, we propose that the concept of urgent questions should be formalised in standing orders by replacing the words emergency questions with urgent questions throughout the rules. And we are also proposing to permanently remove the requirement for party leaders to ask diary questions at First Minister's question time. This is already happening on a temporary basis. Second, we recommend that the current procedures for committee announcements, which appear to have worked well, should be formalised in standing orders. Third, we are proposing some improvements to the rules on members' bills. In particular, we propose to reduce the timescale within which the Scottish Government must legislate should it decide to block a final proposal for a member's bill. Another proposed change is that standing orders should allow any member to speak on the business programme on Wednesday at the discretion of the presiding officer. This will provide a mechanism for non-Bureau members to make comments or raise points on the business programme. As well as the rule changes relating to parliamentary reform, we are proposing some adjustments to the rules about the membership of the SPPA committee. We propose that if a member of the SPPA committee has made a complaint against another member or is the subject of a complaint, then they should not be allowed to participate in the consideration of that complaint. Finally, we are taking the opportunity to propose some other minor changes to standing orders to bring parliamentary rules in line with current practices in areas such as the deadlines for lodging questions. Taken as a whole, this package of rule changes implements a number of the recommendations of the Commission on Parliamentary Reform, as well as making several other improvements to the Parliament's standing orders, and I am pleased to move the motion in my name. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kidd. And we're going to turn to the next item, which is decision time. And the first question is that motion 17566, in the name of Kevin Stewart, on the Fuel Poverty Targets, Definition and Strategy Scotland Bill be agreed. And because this is a bill, we're all going to press our buttons. Members should vote now. The result of the vote on motion 17566 in the name of Kevin Stewart is yes 121. There were no votes against, there were no abstentions. The motion is agreed and the Fuel Poverty Targets Definition and Strategy Scotland Bill is passed. The next question is that motion 17615 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on the Human Tissue Authorisation Scotland Bill be agreed. And again, members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion 17615 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick is yes 116, no 3. There were 2 abstentions. The motion is agreed and the Human Tissue Authorisation Scotland Bill is agreed, is passed. And the final question is that motion 17529 in the name of Bill Kidd on standing order rule changes be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. And that concludes decision time. We're going to move to members' business now in the name of Murdo Fraser on the way of St Andrews, but we'll just take a few moments for members and the Minister to change seats.
Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause. Well more than a year since Alison Thulis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.